Hey guys, tonight we're going to do something a little different. Something maybe a little challenging for your modern comfort-tuned senses. We're not just walking through history tonight. We are quite literally stepping nose first into it. Imagine, if you can, pushing open a heavy wooden gate, leaving the relative quiet of the countryside behind, and entering a medieval city. The first thing, the absolute first thing, that hits you isn't the sight of the buildings or the sound of the crowds. No, it's the smell. A dense, complex, overwhelming wall of odor that wraps around you, seeps into your clothes, and feels like it's trying to physically push you back out. It's a smell that tells 1,000 stories all at once, none of which are particularly pleasant by today's standards. Let's be honest, your modern nose, pampered by air conditioning and constant sanitation, probably wouldn't last 5 minutes before staging a full-blown revolt. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely know what I do here. And hey, if you feel like it, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always wild to see where everyone is tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together, focusing our attention, perhaps a little reluctantly, on the unforgettable aroma of the medieval metropolis. You are standing just inside the city gate. The air outside was clean, carrying the scent of damp earth, distant wood smoke, maybe a hint of livestock from a passing cart, but nothing prepared you for this. It's not a single bad smell, you quickly realize. It's a chorus, a symphony of decay and activity, playing out in the thick air. There's the sharp, acrid tang of urine, unmistakable and everywhere. Layered beneath that is the heavy, sweet-sour reek of decomposition. Discarded food scraps, animal carcasses, who knows what else, all left to rot wherever they landed. You catch a whiff of something deeply earthy, but not in a pleasant way. It's the smell of disturbed soil, mixed with centuries of accumulated filth. And then there are the human elements, the general, unavoidable aroma of unwashed bodies living in close quarters. A musky, stale scent that hangs in the air like a physical presence. The sheer volume of odor is what's truly stunning. In your modern world, unpleasant smells are usually localized. A dumpster behind a restaurant, a public restroom, a particularly ripe subway car. But here, the smell is the environment. It's the baseline, the constant companion to every sight and sound. It coats the buildings, the cobblestones, if you're lucky enough to have them, otherwise it's just mud and refuse. And everyone who lives here. You breathe it in and it feels thick, almost chewable. Your first instinct is probably to gag, to cover your mouth and nose, but quickly realize that's futile. There's nowhere to hide from it. This isn't just about things being dirty in a way you understand. Modern dirt is often just dust and grime. Medieval city dirt was alive with bacteria, fermentation, and decomposition. It was organic, dynamic, constantly changing its specific bouquet depending on the weather, the time of day, and what had most recently been dumped or dropped nearby. A sudden rain shower might temporarily wash some of the surface filth into the gutters or the nearest river, offering a brief muddy reprieve, but it also stirred up settled nastiness, releasing new, potent fumes. A hot summer day, on the other hand, would bake the odors into a potent, stifling intensity, making the air feel heavy and suffocating. Winter might freeze some of the surface smells, but the underlying layers of accumulated waste would still be there, waiting for a thaw. Think about everything that happens in a city, all crammed together with minimal infrastructure. People lived, worked, ate, slept, and disposed of everything within these walls. There were no dedicated sanitation departments, no widespread plumbing bringing clean water in and whisking waste away underground. Water often came from public wells or rivers, which were themselves often used for waste disposal. Imagine drawing your drinking water from a source that also served as a general sewer. It puts a whole new spin on tap water. This lack of basic sanitation, combined with high population density within defensive walls, meant that waste piled up with alarming speed. A mainstream historical fact that underscores this point is that even in some of the largest medieval cities like London or Paris, Effective citywide waste removal systems simply did not exist for most of the Middle Ages. Whatever was generated, human waste, animal manure, kitchen scraps, industrial effluent, largely stayed within the city boundaries, finding its way into streets, ditches, rivers, or simply accumulating in backyards and alleyways. The smell was also deeply informative for the medieval resident in ways that are alien to us. Today, we get information visually, audibly, digitally. In the medieval city, your nose was a crucial sensor. A strong smell of fish meant you were near the market, perhaps near the river where the boats docked. The stench of raw hides and tanning chemicals. You were approaching the tanner's quarter. The sweet malty aroma of brewing. The brewery was nearby. Even the smell of sickness was distinct, often described as sickly sweet or fetid. Warning you to perhaps cross the street, your nose acted as a guide, a warning system, and a locator all rolled into one. It was a constant, involuntary download of data about your immediate environment. Now, you might think medieval people just got used to it. And to a degree, adaptation is powerful. You can become desensitized to constant stimuli, but calling it simple desensitization might be too simplistic. Historians still argue whether medieval noses were biologically different. Perhaps less sensitive receptors developed over generations exposed to these conditions, or whether people were simply conditioned from birth to perceive these odors as the normal state of the world. Much like we perceive the smell of traffic fumes or fast food today without constant revulsion. Were their olfactory brains wired differently, or did they just build up an incredible mental tolerance, filtering out the worst of it like background noise? It's a fascinating debate, touching on biology, psychology, and cultural conditioning. Did they just switch off their noses, or did their noses actually change? We can never truly know, but the idea that they were simply immune to the smell seems unlikely. Perhaps it was more like living next to a busy highway. You learn to tune out the constant roar, but it's still there, impacting your environment in subtle ways. Consider a quirky or fringe tidbit related to this olfactory overload. In some cities, especially later in the medieval period, there were attempts to mitigate the smell, not just for comfort, but because it was believed bad air caused disease. More on that later. One method, recorded in various accounts, was the practice of burning aromatic woods or herbs, particularly in public spaces or during processions. Imagine trying to combat the overwhelming multi-layered stink of an entire city, its accumulated human and animal waste, its industrial effluvia, its rotting garbage, with handfuls of burning rosemary or juniper. It's like trying to put out a forest fire with a teacup. The effort was perhaps more symbolic than effective, a small, aromatic island in a vast ocean of stench. But it shows that they weren't entirely oblivious or accepting. They noticed the bad smells and made, often inadequate, attempts to purify the air, even if their understanding of why the air was bad was rooted in different theories than our own. The modern world has largely sanitized itself into an olfactory desert by comparison. We live in climate-controlled boxes, surrounded by synthetic scents designed to mask or replace natural ones. Our waste disappears magically down pipes, our streets are power-washed, our industries are often located far from residential areas, and our personal hygiene standards are historically unprecedented. Stepping into a medieval city would be a shock to our entire sensory system, but perhaps most profoundly to our noses. It would be an intense, unavoidable education in just how much information and experience smell can convey when it hasn't been engineered into submission. It makes you appreciate the humble sewer system and the daily garbage truck in a whole new way. They are the invisible heroes of your modern olfactory comfort. As you stand there by the gate, the sheer density and variety of the smells begin to resolve into individual notes, though they are always mixed together. You can start to distinguish the ammonia bite from the sickly sweetness of decay, the earthy richness of manure from the metallic tang of certain trades. It's a constant, shifting, living smellscape, and you've only just arrived. This is just the initial greeting. The city stretches out before you, layer upon layer of scent waiting to be explored. Each street, each building, each alleyway promising its own unique, often challenging, olfactory signature. And remember, this isn't just a passive experience. These smells are woven into the fabric of daily life, impacting health, social interactions, and even how people understood their place in the world. You are not just smelling the city, you are smelling its history, its struggles, its very existence, raw and unfiltered. And it smells potent, very, very potent. You take a tentative step forward, bracing yourself for the journey deeper into this aromatic labyrinth. You've felt the initial impact, that atmospheric assault on your nostrils right at the gate. Now, as you venture tentatively into the narrow, winding streets, you start to dissect why the air carries such a potent, layered bouquet of unpleasantness. It doesn't take long to understand. The sources of the smell are everywhere, integrated into the very fabric of the city's existence. They are the unglamorous, unavoidable byproducts of human and animal life, all compressed into a relatively small, walled-off space with minimal infrastructure designed to handle them. Perhaps the most pervasive and immediately recognizable element of the city's aroma is the overwhelming presence of human waste. Forget your modern expectations of flushing toilets and underground sewer systems. For most people in a medieval city, indoor plumbing simply didn't exist. The vast majority of residents relied on chamber pots. These were exactly what they sound like, portable containers kept indoors for collecting urine and feces. And once the chamber pot was full, its contents had to go somewhere. The most common somewhere? Often straight out the window into the straw below. Yes, you read that right. Imagine walking down a medieval street, glancing up, and having to dodge a sudden, unwelcome shower of human effluent. There were sometimes regulations against this, particularly in larger cities later in the period, but they were difficult to enforce and likely widely ignored, especially under the cover of darkness. So the streets, already serving as thoroughfares, were also frequently open sewers. This isn't just a quirky detail, it's a mainstream historical fact that the disposal of human waste directly into streets, ditches, or nearby waterways was a common and persistent problem throughout medieval Europe. The resulting smell was predictably overpowering, a sharp ammoniac tang that permeated the air constantly, especially in poorer, more crowded neighborhoods where houses were packed together and sanitation was even less of a priority. Even for those who had slightly better facilities, the problem didn't disappear. Wealthier homes might have a garderobe, which was essentially a primitive latrine or privy built into the wall of a house or castle. It typically consisted of a wooden seat over a vertical shaft that dropped the waste down into a moat, a cesspit below, or sometimes, again, directly onto the ground or into a ditch outside the walls. While perhaps offering slightly more privacy and containing the immediate smell, inside the house, these guardrabes simply relocated the problem. The cesspits needed to be emptied periodically, a job that was both hazardous and incredibly unpleasant, usually performed by laborers known charmingly as gong farmers or rakers. Where the contents of these pits, rich in decomposing organic matter, were then often carted away, sometimes to be used as fertilizer outside the city, a potentially profitable, if smelly, side hustle, but often just dumped in less central locations, where they continued to contribute to the overall olfactory tapestry. Then there was the animal situation. Medieval cities weren't just for people. They were bustling hubs of animal activity too. Horses and oxen were used for transport and hauling goods, leaving behind piles of manure on the streets wherever they went. Livestock like pigs, chickens, and sometimes even cattle were often kept within city walls, providing food and other resources, but also generating vast quantities of waste. Picture a herd of pigs rooting through refuse in an alleyway, or chickens scratching in someone's backyard. It wasn't exactly a clean, tidy process. This constant production of animal manure added another layer to the city's smell profile, a rich, earthy, but undeniably pungent aroma that mingled with the human waste, creating a complex biological cocktail that was always brewing under the medieval sun. This wasn't just a bit of scattered droppings, it was a significant daily influx of organic waste onto streets and into living spaces. Household garbage was another major contributor. Food scraps, ashes from fires, used for heating and cooking, broken pottery, old straw used as bedding or floor covering. All of this accumulated rapidly. Without organized garbage collection services, residents typically dispose of their trash in the easiest way possible. This meant tossing it into the street, into a nearby ditch or stream, or just piling it up in a backyard or alleyway. Over time, these piles of refuse would grow, attracting vermin and insects and decomposing into a putrid, foul-smelling mess. Imagine the smell of rotting food, damp ashes, and general decay multiplied by thousands of households doing the same thing day after day. It's a smell that gets into your throat, thick and cloying. Beyond the general residential mess, the city also housed a wide range of trades and industries, many of which generated their own unique and particularly noxious smells. Think about the tanneries, for instance. Tanning hides involves soaking animal skins in vats of chemicals, and often, traditionally, animal urine or feces because ammonia helped break down tissues. The process produced incredibly strong, foul odors that clung to the air for blocks around. Tanners were often relegated to specific quarters of the city, usually near a river, which they used and polluted, and often downwind of the main residential areas, precisely because their trade smelled so appallingly bad. But even relegated, that stench was still within the city walls, just concentrated in certain areas. Butchers, while providing essential food, also created waste. Blood, guts, offal, and animal carcasses or parts that weren't used. This organic material, if not quickly disposed of or processed, decomposed rapidly, especially in warmer weather, adding a heavy, metallic, sickeningly sweet smell of decay to the air. Dyers used strong chemicals and sometimes animal products to create their colors, releasing pungent fumes and often dumping chemical-laden wastewater into the nearest water source. Brewers, while sometimes producing a pleasant, malty aroma near the brewery itself, also generated waste byproducts. Even less obvious trades contributed. Blacksmiths produced smoke and soot. Fishmongers left behind fish guts and scales, often in the street, creating a smell that combined decay with the brine of the sea or river. All these distinct smells, the sharp ammonia of urine, the earthy richness of manure, the sickly sweet rot of garbage and offal, the acrid bite of tanning chemicals, the metallic tang of blood, mixed and mingled in the city air, creating that overwhelming composite odor you encountered at the gate. There was no single culprit, but a multitude of sources, each layering its contribution onto the next. The cumulative effect was a smellscape that was not just unpleasant, but fundamentally different in intensity and complexity from anything most people today have experienced. It was a constant, living presence, thick and palpable in the air. This brings us to a quirky or tear-fringed tidbit about how people tried to deal with the sheer volume of waste beyond just tossing it out. In some coastal or riverside cities, tides or river currents were sometimes relied upon as a sort of natural flushing mechanism. Streets might be designed to slope towards the water, or specific channels might be used to direct wastewater and refuse. However, this simply moved the pollution from the city streets to the surrounding water bodies, which were often the source of drinking water and food, fish, for the same city, creating a vicious cycle of contamination. Some cities even had specific laws or customs about which hours people were allowed to dump waste into the streets or rivers, often stipulating nighttime hours, presumably to spare passers-by during the day, but also ensuring that the morning air was particularly foul. Imagine you couldn't just empty your chamber pot whenever you wanted. You had to wait for the designated hour of legalized street dumping. A true sign of urban planning brilliance, wouldn't you agree? Excuse me, could you hold that? It's not quite 10 p.m. yet, and I don't want to break the law. Well, historians still argue whether the sheer volume of waste was primarily due to a lack of knowledge about hygiene and disease. The germ theory of disease wouldn't emerge until the 19th century, long after the medieval period ended, or simply a lack of resources and effective governance to implement widespread sanitation systems. Was it ignorance, poverty, or administrative incapacity that kept medieval cities so profoundly smelly? It's likely a combination of factors, but the debate highlights that we shouldn't necessarily view medieval people as liking or being completely oblivious to the smells, but rather as lacking the tools, understanding, and societal structures to do much about them on a large scale. They knew things smelled bad, and they knew bad smells were often associated with sickness, the miasma theory, which posited that disease was carried in bad air, or miasma, was prevalent. They just didn't have the modern scientific understanding or the technological means to effectively combat the problem at its source. The absence of widespread public works for sanitation, like paved and sloped streets designed for drainage, dedicated underground sewers, or organized waste collection services, meant that the waste generated by the city stayed in the city, cycling through its environment in various states of decomposition. Rain might wash surface filth into ditches, but the underlying ground was often saturated with centuries of accumulated nastiness. Rivers flowing through cities became heavily polluted, often little more than open sewers, yet still used for drinking, washing, and industry. Wells could become contaminated by nearby cesspits. The very air you breathed was a complex aerosol of organic particles and chemical fumes. Consider the sensory experience again. It wasn't just the smell, it was the texture of the ground underfoot, often muddy, uneven, and covered in various forms of waste. The sight of refuse piles, dead animals, and overflowing ditches. The buzz of flies and other insects attracted to the decay, the occasional scuttling of rats. All these elements combined with the smell to create an environment that was visually, audibly, and tactilely challenging, but olfactorily dominant. The smell was the constant background against which all other sensory experiences played out. And remember, this wasn't a temporary state. This was the everyday reality for centuries. Generations of people were born, lived, worked, and died within these olfactory landscapes. It puts a new perspective on their resilience, doesn't it? Or perhaps their capacity for adaptation. You can almost feel your own modern senses protesting, wanting to retreat, to find clean air. But for them, this was the air. It was the smell of their home, their livelihood, their community. A rather pungent community, granted, but theirs nonetheless. It makes you profoundly grateful for the simple things, like indoor plumbing that actually goes somewhere and a garbage truck that magically makes the bins disappear once a week. These mundane modern conveniences are the result of centuries of incremental improvements aimed, in part, at mitigating the very smells you are now immersing yourself in. And trust me, you are only scratching the surface of the medieval stink. There are specific places and times within the city walls that are even more memorable and less pleasant, much, much less pleasant. You've cataloged the general background noise of medieval stink, the street level effluvia, the domestic discard, the animal contributions, the industrial output. It's a constant, low-level hum of decay and waste, always present, always demanding attention from your poor nose. But within this baseline of unpleasantness, there were particular hotspots, places where the olfactory assault wasn't just background noise, but a full-blown symphony of stench, rising to a crescendo that could make your eyes water and your stomach churn. These were the places where the city's messy reality converged, concentrating specific odors into overwhelming levels. Think about the market. This was the beating heart of the city's economy, a vibrant, crowded nexus of activity. People selling everything from fresh produce and live animals to butchered meat, fish, cloth, and crafts. And where there are large crowds and large quantities of organic goods, there are smells. The vegetable stalls would offer earthy, sometimes decaying aromas. Live animals, sheep, chickens, perhaps pigs, would contribute the strong smell of their bodies, their waste, and the general farmyard scent amplified by being penned tightly together. But the real heavy hitters in the market, the butcher's stalls and the fishmongers. Stepping near the butcher's area was an experience. You'd see carcasses hanging, raw meat laid out, and the ground would often be slick with blood and offal. Without refrigeration, meat spoiled quickly, especially in warmer months. The smell wasn't just fresh blood, it was the sickly sweet, metallic tang of dried blood mixed with the heavy, cloying odor of decaying tissue. Butchers would often toss waste pieces, guts, fat trimmings, unwanted bones, into piles nearby or directly into the street or a gutter, where they'd attract flies and begin decomposing immediately, adding a layer of putrid stench to the scene. Imagine trying to buy your dinner while breathing in the concentrated aroma of death and decay. It required a certain constitution, or perhaps just a completely desensitized olfactory system. The fishmongers were equally, if not more, challenging. Fish, especially if not fresh from the water and kept cool, a difficult feat, produces a particularly potent, gag-inducing smell as it decomposes. The stalls would reek of brine, fish scales, decaying flesh, and the general eau de harbor if it was a coastal city. Guts and heads would be discarded, often right there compounding the problem. The combination of fish guts putrefying in the sun and the overall market crowds, animal smells, and general waste created an olfactory environment that was truly next level. It makes your modern visit to the supermarket fish counter seem like a walk through a pristine garden, doesn't it? And they complain about a slight fishy whiff. Beyond the market proper, but intrinsically linked, were the slaughterhouses. Often located near the city walls or by a river for water access and waste disposal into the river naturally, these were places of intense, visceral smells. Blood, guts, fear, death, and rapid decomposition. The smell of a slaughterhouse is unique and powerful, a mix of metallic blood, warm animal bodies, and the swift, unpleasant aroma of discarded organs and hides. Even downwind, you would likely catch the stench, a constant reminder of the messy process that produced the meat on your table. Historians often note that regulations were sometimes attempted to move these particularly noxious trades outside the city walls or at least restrict their locations, highlighting that authorities were aware of the problems they caused. But enforcement and willingness to relocate essential businesses were often weak. This is a mainstream historical fact. Authorities recognized certain trades were exceptionally foul and sometimes tried to segregate them, though with limited success. Public baths, surprisingly, weren't always havens of cleanliness either. While the concept of public bathing existed in some medieval cities, especially influenced by Roman traditions or in specific contexts like monasteries, they weren't the sparkling, chlorinated oases you might envision. Water was often used by multiple people and might not be frequently changed, leading to stagnant, lukewarm pools smelling of bodies, sweat, and whatever else people brought into the water. The air in the bathhouse could be thick with humidity, trapped body odors, and perhaps the faint whiff of decay if the water sources were less than pure or drainage was poor. Sometimes baths even served as social hubs, blurring the lines between washing and socializing, adding to the general human presence in the air. While they offered a chance to get clean, or cleaner, the environment itself could be pungent. And then consider specific events or times. Festivals, fairs, pilgrimages, any occasion that drew large numbers of people into a confined space for an extended period without corresponding increases in sanitation infrastructure was guaranteed to amplify the smells. More people meant more bodies, more sweat, more food consumption, and thus more waste, more animals used for transport or entertainment, and a general concentration of all the baseline odors. Imagine a medieval fairground, the smells of roasting meat mixing with animal dung, unwashed bodies, spilled ale, and the ever-present background aroma of the city's general filth. It makes a modern music festival seem positively sterile. The absolute worst, though, must have been during times of epidemic, when sickness swept through a medieval city, and with sanitation as it was, this happened often, most notably with the Black Death. The smells must have been horrific. The smell of sickness itself, the odor of unwashed, feverish bodies, the stench of vomit and dysentery, and then the overwhelming, pervasive smell of death. Bodies would pile up faster than they could be buried, especially during the worst outbreaks. The air would hang thick with the aroma of decay, perhaps mixed with the acrid smell of smoke from attempts to ward off the miasmas by burning aromatic herbs or even, in desperate times, furniture and clothes. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was terrifying, as the smell of death was directly linked in people's minds to the presence of the plague. It was a physical manifestation of the invisible killer. Waterways running through the city were essentially open sewers. Rivers like the Thames in London or the Seine in Paris were heavily polluted, receiving everything from human and animal waste dumped from guardrobes and streets to the effluent from tanneries, dyers, and slaughterhouses. The smell emanating from these rivers, especially in warmer months or during low tide, must have been overpowering. A mix of sewage, industrial waste, and rotting organic matter. Yet, these same rivers were often the source of drinking water, the means of transportation, and the location of waterfront markets. You'd be buying fish caught from a river that also served as the city's toilet and industrial drain. A truly integrated system, though not one you'd want to replicate. This brings us to a rather quirky or fringe tidbit. People did try to combat the smells, not just tolerate them. While they lacked modern sanitation, they certainly noticed the stink. They used perfumes, pomanders, balls of fragrant substances like ambergris, civet, or herbs carried on the person, and sachets of dried flowers and herbs placed in homes or worn on clothing. Wealthy individuals might carry nosegays, small bunches of flowers or herbs, to hold to their noses when passing particularly foul spots, a practice that became particularly associated with the times of plague, believed to ward off the miasma. But this wasn't about cleaning, it was about masking, about trying to create a small bubble of pleasant aroma in a sea of stench. It's like using a single air freshener in a landfill, a valiant effort, but ultimately futile against the scale of the problem. Another odd practice was the belief that certain strong smells could cure illness or ward off bad air, leading people to seek out specific pungent aromas, sometimes ones we would find offensive today. Historians still argue whether medieval people's tolerance for these smells was purely biological adaptation. Did their noses literally become less sensitive over generations? Psychological conditioning, they just got used to it because there was no alternative. Or if historical sources downplay how much the smells genuinely bothered them, did they simply complain less in surviving records because it was such a mundane, everyday reality? Or did their sensory perception genuinely differ from ours? It's hard to say definitively. Surviving accounts sometimes mention the bad smells, often in conjunction with complaints about unhealthiness, but they rarely dwell on the sensory experience itself in the way a modern person might. This leaves scholars debating how much of our revulsion is a result of modern expectations and how much is an accurate reflection of medieval discomfort. What is clear is that the sheer volume and variety of unpleasant odors created smell maps of the city. Certain areas were known to be worse than others. You'd navigate not just by street names or landmarks, but by holding your breath when you approach the tannery quarter or bracing yourself for the market on a hot day. This olfactory geography was as real and as important as the visual map of streets and buildings. It dictated where people lived if they could afford to be picky, downwind of the smelly trades, uphill from the polluted river, where certain businesses could operate, and how people moved through their environment. The reality is, you could probably survive the smells. Your modern senses would protest violently at first, but humans are remarkably adaptable. You might learn to breathe through your mouth in certain areas, or simply tune out the worst offenders, but you would never forget them. The lingering scent on your clothes, the taste left in your mouth after walking near the fish market, the way the smells changed with the weather, sharper after rain, heavier and more potent in the heat. These were the constant sensory inputs that defined much of the urban experience. It's tempting to romanticize the medieval city, the bustling markets, the impressive cathedrals, the vibrant community life. And those things were real. But so too was the smell. It was the unvarnished reality of life before modern sanitation, before germ theory, before effective waste disposal. It was the smell of people and animals living in close proximity, of necessary but messy industries, and of the constant battle against organic decay in a world without refrigeration or widespread cleaning agreements. And believe it or not, some of the most infamous odors came from places you might expect to be cleaner, or at least less disgusting than a pile of guts. Yes, even public hygiene efforts could go spectacularly wrong. So you've got the smell map etched into your memory now. The market with its meat and fish decay, the slaughterhouses with their blood and guts, the potentially dubious bathhouses, the festival crowds, the nightmare of epidemic times, and the overpowering stench of the polluted rivers acting as open sewers. It's a relentless assault, isn't it? A constant reminder that organic matter doesn't just politely disappear when you're done with it. And faced with this reality, this overwhelming tide of filth, medieval people weren't entirely passive. They did try. They made efforts, however rudimentary or ill-informed by modern standards, to manage the waste, to clean things up, to impose some semblance of order on the chaos. The problem? Their efforts often weren't just ineffective. Sometimes they inadvertently made things even worse. Imagine trying to clean a street that's layered with refuse, animal droppings, and perhaps a casual dead rat. You might try sweeping, but sweeping just moves the problem. You push the filth from your doorstep into a pile in the middle of the street, or perhaps towards the gutter, hoping the next rain will wash it away, which of course just transfers the problem to the nearest waterway or lower-lying area. Street cleaning existed in some form in many cities, often mandated by ordinances that required householders to clean the area in front of their property. A mainstream historical fact here: medieval city authorities did pass laws attempting to regulate the dumping of waste and mandate street cleaning, indicating official recognition of the problem, even if enforcement was patchy and the methods were inadequate. They knew it was bad, they just didn't have the tools, knowledge, or infrastructure to fix it properly. And those gutters? They weren't your modern, neatly channeled stormwater drains. Often, they were just depressions in the middle or side of the street intended to carry away rainwater, but primarily serving as convenient conduits for liquid waste and whatever solid waste was small or light enough to be pushed into them. They would clog easily, turning streets into sluggish, foul-smelling streams of sewage during or after rain. The smell rising from a blocked or stagnant gutter was a concentrated brew of everything the street contained, truly gag-inducing. Walking down the street became a careful navigation, not just around piles of waste, but around overflowing gutters and pools of questionable liquid. Then there was the classic dump it in the river approach. We touched on this, but it bears repeating because it was such a fundamental, flawed strategy. Rivers were seen as nature's conveyor belt. Load up your waste, and it'll carry it downstream, away from you. Tanners would dump chemical-laden waste from treating hides, which is a whole other level of potent smell. Dyers would release effluent, butchers would toss a fall, and countless private and public latrines were built to empty directly into the water. The logic was simple: out of sight, out of mind. Except it wasn't out of mind, because the smell often just wafted back up. And crucially, those living downstream were now drinking and using your wastewater. It's the medieval equivalent of saying, "not my problem," and hoping for the best, while simultaneously poisoning your neighbors and yourself further down the riverbed. Talk about an integrated water system. Public latrines, where they existed, were often communal pits or structures built over rivers or cesspools. While better than nothing for concentrating waste, they were frequently overcrowded, poorly maintained, and incredibly smelly. The pits would fill up, requiring dangerous and unpleasant emptying by specialized laborers called gong farmers, or rockin' in the hool, which gives you a delightful mental image, doesn't it? These cesspits could overflow into nearby properties or streets, releasing concentrated, putrid smells and waste. The air around a medieval public latrine must have been truly eye-watering. It makes a modern porta potty seem like a 5-star spa facility by comparison. Private latrines or garderobes in wealthier homes and castles were often chutes built into walls that dropped waste outside the building or famously into the moat below. On the face of it, ingenious. Get the waste out of the house. But the reality was the smell from the accumulated waste below would often waft back up the chute and into the room, giving the garderobe its name, which literally means wardrobe in French, possibly because the smell was thought to deter moths from clothes stored nearby, a rather grim form of pest control. A castle moat might look picturesque from a distance, But up close, especially if it received multiple guard rope deposits, it was essentially a ring of liquid sewage around the fortress. Not quite the romantic image of medieval life you see in the movies, is it? Though perhaps strategically useful for deterring invaders who were sensitive to odor. Fear our arrows and the smell. Attempts to cover waste were also common, but often ineffective. Throwing a bit of straw or earth over a pile of garbage or animal dung might hide it visually for a moment, but it did nothing to stop the underlying decomposition in smell. In fact, by trapping moisture and organic matter, it might even accelerate the process. It's the ultimate in shoving the problem under the rug, or in this case, under a thin layer of dirt. The smell always finds a way. Always. And animals, bless their unwitting hearts, were both contributors to and supposed solutions for the waste problem. Pigs, in particular, were often allowed to roam relatively freely in medieval streets, scavenging on refuse. This provided a form of waste disposal, consuming organic scraps that would otherwise rot. However, pigs also produced their own waste, which added to the street's general miasma. While they ate some garbage, they certainly didn't clean the streets. They just helped process some of the edible bits and left the rest, along with their own contributions. It was a form of recycling, sure, but a very smelly and unhygienic one. Imagine navigating a busy street, dodging both piles of garbage, and the pigs enthusiastically rooting through them. A delightful obstacle course. Attempts at masking smells were perhaps the most prevalent hygiene effort, but again, they didn't actually clean anything. As we mentioned before, people used perfumes, herbs, and pomanders. Burning aromatic substances like frankincense or herbs was also common, especially in churches and wealthy homes, and during times of plague in the streets themselves. The idea was to create a more pleasant aroma, or based on the miasma theory of disease, to purify the air. It's the historical equivalent of spraying air freshener in a room that desperately needs cleaning. It might make it temporarily less offensive, but the source of the problem is still very much there, festering away beneath the layer of potpourri. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that some medieval medical texts recommended inhaling the fumes of strong, even foul-smelling substances, like vinegar or sulfur, as a way to draw out bad humors or ward off plague, based on the principle that like cures like, or that a stronger smell could overpower a weaker, dangerous one. Not exactly Febreze. Why did they struggle so much? Beyond the lack of technology like plumbing and effective waste collection systems, a key factor was the lack of understanding of microbiology. They didn't know about bacteria and viruses. They didn't understand that filth wasn't just aesthetically unpleasant and smelly, it was a breeding ground for disease. The dominant medical theory was the miasma theory. That disease was caused by bad air, foul smells emanating from decaying matter. So their attempts at hygiene were often focused on getting rid of the smell, masking it, washing it away into a river, or avoiding the bad air, rather than actually eliminating the source of the pathogens. They were fighting the symptom, not the cause. Historians still argue whether the persistence of these ineffective practices was due primarily to technological limitations. Economic constraints, proper sanitation infrastructure is expensive, ingrained social habits, or the fundamental misunderstanding of disease transmission. Was it simply the best they could do with the resources and knowledge available? Or were there lost opportunities for better practices? It's a complex question, as change happens slowly, and established ways of doing things, even smelly ones, are hard to overturn. Plus, getting everyone in a crowded city to agree on and pay for centralized sanitation was probably as challenging then as getting neighbors to agree on bin collection schedules now. Some things never change, except perhaps the smell of the bins. The sheer volume of waste was also a factor that overwhelmed their capacity. With dense populations living in relatively small areas, the amount of human and animal waste, household garbage, and industrial byproduct generated daily was enormous. Without organized systems for collection, transport, and disposal away from the inhabited areas, it was a losing battle. The waste accumulated faster than it could be dealt with using manual labor and simple tools. So you see, it wasn't that medieval people were necessarily lazy or enjoyed living in filth. They tried, in their own way, to keep things clean and manage their waste. But their methods were hampered by a fundamental lack of scientific understanding and technological limitations. Dumping waste into rivers just moved the problem downstream and polluted water sources. Sweeping streets just created new piles. Masking smells did nothing to eliminate the source of decay and disease. Public latrines concentrated waste but were often poorly managed. Guardrobes were ingenious but smelly, and using animals for scavenging was a messy, incomplete solution. Their attempts at cleanliness were often like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teacup. A lot of effort, but ultimately inadequate to the scale of the problem. Which is why, despite their efforts, the medieval city remained, by modern standards, an overwhelmingly smelly and unhygienic place. And understanding why their attempts failed helps underline just how different their sensory reality was from our own. So, you've grasped the general baseline of medieval city aroma, a powerful, persistent, and often profoundly unpleasant experience for the average pedestrian. But does wealth buy you a better nosescape? Well, maybe a slightly less noxious one, but certainly not a fragrant paradise. While everyone in a medieval city was, to some extent, swimming in the same general sea of smells, the richer you were, the more resources you could potentially throw at minimizing your personal exposure and creating little aromatic bubbles for yourself. It wasn't about eliminating the source of the smells, it was about building barriers, both physical and olfactory. Think about where the wealthy lived. The grandest houses and palaces weren't typically plopped down right next to the tanneries or the public slaughterhouses, though they might not be miles away either. They'd often be in more central, established districts or along slightly wider streets where airflow might theoretically be a little better. Their homes were larger, with more private space, which meant less density of people contributing to localized smells. They might have private wells for water, reducing reliance on the potentially tainted public supply or river water. And while they certainly produced waste just like everyone else, they might have had servants specifically tasked with managing it, perhaps emptying chamber pots into a private cesspit more promptly than a poorer household could manage, or arranging for waste to be carted further away, even if further away still just meant outside the city walls to a burgeoning dung heap. A mainstream historical fact is that wealthier districts in medieval cities often had slightly stricter regulations or more resources dedicated to removing refuse from main thoroughfares. Although this was more about keeping the streets passable and looking presentable than any deep understanding of hygiene. Inside their homes, the wealthy employed various strategies. Floors might be covered with rushes, which were aromatic herbs and plant matter meant to provide a softer surface and a nicer smell than bare earth or stone. However, these rushes were often laid down on top of previous layers that weren't fully removed, trapping dirt, food scraps, and other unpleasantness underneath. Over time, the decaying organic matter beneath the fresh rushes would contribute its own, truly foul odor. It was like using a very fancy medieval form of potpourri to cover up a fundamental lack of cleaning, creating a complex, layered smell profile of fresh herbs mixed with underlying rot. Not exactly a home sweet home by modern standards. Fireplaces and braziers were common, and while primarily for heating and cooking, burning aromatic woods or adding spices to the fire could release more pleasant smells into the air. Imagine walking into a grand hall and getting a whiff of oak smoke mingled with perhaps a hint of dried lavender or rosemary. A welcome contrast to the street outside, no doubt. However, even these homes weren't entirely immune. Smells from the kitchen, which could involve the less than fresh ingredients we discussed. Smells from the guardrobes, those chute-based latrines, could be potent smell conduits. And smells from the simple presence of unwashed bodies and clothes would still linger. The most famous way the wealthy tried to combat the omnipresent stench was through the use of personal fragrances. Perfumes, pomanders, and scented items were status symbols precisely, because they offered a degree of relief from the overwhelming unpleasantness of the outside world. These weren't the subtle, nuanced perfumes we have today. Medieval perfumes were often strong, heavy scents designed to overpower, not complement. Think musk, civet, derived from animal glands, and very potent, ambergris from whales, and rich, exotic spices like frankincense, myrrh, and cloves. These ingredients were expensive, often imported from distant lands, making their use a clear indicator of wealth and status. You weren't just wearing it a nice scent, you were wearing your ability to afford something that literally fought off the dominant smell of poverty and filth. Pomanders were particularly popular. Small metal orbs, often beautifully crafted and jeweled, containing aromatic substances. You might hold it up to your nose when passing a particularly malodorous spot, or simply wear it dangling from your waist or neck, creating a small, personal cloud of fragrance. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the contents of pomanders were often complex mixtures of dry and moist ingredients, including ground spices, fragrant resins, scented earths, and sometimes even substances like civet paste or musk, all combined according to intricate recipes thought to have medicinal or protective properties against miasma. Holding one up wasn't just about pleasure, it was seen as a defense mechanism. Imagine the smell of a street and then suddenly shoving a metal ball full of ground cloves, rose petals, and civet up to your nostrils. It's less about smelling good and more about smelling different and powerful enough to mentally block out the alternative. Scented gloves were another luxury item, allowing you to carry a pleasant fragrance quite literally at your fingertips. These gloves were steeped in aromatic oils and essences, so every time you moved your hands, you'd release a puff of perfume. Again, expensive, impractical for labor, and a clear sign you weren't scrabbling around in the dirt. Even clothing could be scented, kept in chests with sachets of dried herbs like lavender or rosemary. While it might seem like overkill to us, in a world saturated with bad smells, any attempt to make your personal space or person smell even marginally better was a significant effort and a mark of distinction. Bathing habits among the wealthy are a fascinating area, and one where modern assumptions often clash with historical reality. While we tend to associate cleanliness with frequent full immersion bathing, medieval practices were more varied and often less frequent by our standards. Wealthy homes might have access to private bathtubs, often made of wood or metal, but heating large quantities of water was a labor-intensive process. Baths might be taken more for relaxation or social reasons than for strict daily hygiene as we understand it. Public bathhouses existed in many cities and were used by people of various social classes, though facilities might differ. These bathhouses, while providing a place to wash, could also be sites of other activities, sometimes including prostitution, which could give them a questionable reputation and contribute their own set of smells. Steam, sweat, the communal bathwater. It wasn't always a pristine spa experience. Historians still argue whether the frequency of bathing truly declined after the Roman period due to moral objections or practical reasons like fuel cost and plague fears, or if it remained relatively consistent but changed in form. What is clear is that cleanliness meant different things. It might mean changing your linen shirts frequently. Linen was relatively easy to wash and absorb sweat and dirt, acting like a first layer of defense for the body, using dry methods like rubbing with cloths, or focusing on visible cleanliness rather than the kind of deep cleaning that eliminates bacteria. Perfumes and scented linens might have been seen as achieving a form of cleanliness by masking unpleasant odors, without the need for frequent, full-body washing. Consider the bedding in a wealthy household. While they might have soft mattresses and fine linens, these would still absorb sweat, body odors, and ambient smells over time. Frequent washing of large items like blankets or mattresses was impractical. So even in the most luxurious bedrooms, the accumulated smells of bodies, stale air, and residual environmental odors would likely be present. It wasn't just the streets that smelled, it was the indoor environment too, though hopefully less intensely in wealthier homes due to better ventilation and slightly more frequent cleaning efforts compared to a cramped, poor dwelling. Imagine you are a wealthy merchant in London. Your house is substantial, built of stone and timber, unlike the flimsier wattle and daub of the poor. You have glazed windows letting in more light and allowing you to close out some of the street noise and smell when needed, though glass was expensive. You have servants to manage your household waste, take care of the fireplace, and bring you fresh linen. You own a finely wrought silver pomander filled with expensive civet and rosewater paste. When you step out of your door, even though your street might be cleaner than the lane behind the butcher shop, you are still immediately hit by the general city smell. The dung from horses and carts, the stagnant water in the gutters, the waft from a nearby cookshop, the collective body odor of the crowd. You hold your pomander to your nose, take a deep breath of expensive perfume, and steel yourself for the journey. Your destination might be a business meeting in the city, or perhaps a visit to a noble's home. You navigate the streets, trying to avoid the worst puddles and piles. The sensory contrast must have been constant. The foul, unavoidable smells of the city punctuated by brief, intentional encounters with pleasant aromas. The herbs scattered in a clean hall, the scent of incense in a church, the perfume of the wealthy individuals you meet. Your personal scent wasn't just a preference, it was a necessary shield, a way to assert control over your immediate sensory environment in a world where external smells were largely chaotic and overpowering. It was like walking around with a personal air filter, albeit a very expensive and only mildly effective one that just replaced one strong smell with another. Even with all these efforts, the wealthy couldn't entirely escape the pervasive smells. Disease didn't solely afflict the poor, proving that just smelling better didn't protect you from the underlying causes of sickness. And during major events like festivals or outbreaks of plague, the smell landscape would shift dramatically for everyone. A festival might bring the smells of feasting, roasting meats, ale, and crowds, potentially more pleasant than everyday smells, but still intense and perhaps mixed with vomit and general revelry-induced mess by the end. A plague outbreak, however, would introduce the horrifying smells of sickness, death, and attempts to purify the air by burning strong-smelling substances in the streets, creating a truly nightmarish olfactory experience that wealth offered little protection against. So, while being rich in the Middle Ages meant you had a slightly better chance of avoiding the most concentrated areas of filth, living in a slightly cleaner house, and being able to afford expensive perfumes to mask the worst of it, it didn't mean you lived in an odor-free world. You were still very much a part of the medieval smellscape. Your experience might have been nuanced by layers of expensive fragrance, but the baseline reality of decomposition, waste, and general effluence was never truly far away. The air was still thick with the collective effluvium of human and animal life, and all the processes that sustained it. You just had fancier tools for trying to pretend it wasn't quite so bad, or at least for making sure you smelled better than the person next to you, which was a form of social currency in itself. While the wealthy might have had their expensive perfumes and herb-strewn floors, offering brief, perfumed respites from the general city stench, nobody, and I mean nobody, truly escaped the concentrated blasts of specific, horrifying odor emanating from the city's essential industries. Think of the overall city smell as a constant, low-grade hum of unpleasantness. Then imagine certain districts, or even specific streets, where that hum suddenly became a deafening roar of pure, unadulterated olfactory assault. These were the domains of the guilds and workshops whose crafts, while vital to the economy, were inherently spectacularly smelly. Step right up, or perhaps hold your nose and edge away, into the world of the tanners. To turn raw animal hides, which are essentially decaying flesh, into usable leather, medieval tanners employed processes that were, well, let's just say they didn't smell like roses. First, the hides had to be cleaned of flesh and hair. This often involves soaking them in pits of lime and water, which produces its own distinct alkaline sting in the air. But the truly eye-watering part came next, softening the hides. This was commonly done using a process called baiting, which traditionally involves soaking the hides in a solution made from animal feces, most notoriously dog dung, known as album graecum. Yes, you heard that right. Poo pits, soaking putrefying animal skins in literal animal waste. The smell? A unique bouquet of ammonia from the urine content, decay from the organic matter, and the inherent stink of rotting flesh. Imagine the worst public restroom you've ever encountered. Then add the smell of a rendering plant on a hot day, and you're getting close. It was so bad, tanners were almost universally relegated to specific areas, often near rivers, for water supply and waste disposal, and downwind of the main city or outside the city walls altogether. A mainstream historical fact is that city regulations frequently mandated the location of tanneries away from residential or market areas due to the intensity of their smell and waste. Beyond the tanners, you'd find the dyers. While some natural dyes could smell quite pleasant, think of the earthy scent of woad or the rich aroma of madder, the processes involved in dyeing textiles were often far from fragrant. Dyers use vats of hot liquid, often containing strong chemicals or mordants necessary to fix the colors to the fabric. Alum, a common mordant, has a sharp, slightly metallic smell. And once again, urine often made an appearance. Stale human urine, collected in vast quantities, was a valuable resource for dyers because of its ammonia content, which helped prepare the wool or linen to accept the dye. So you'd have the smell of large vats of hot, fermenting urine mingling with the smells of boiling textiles in various chemicals or natural plant matter. It could be a steamy, pungent, slightly acidic aroma, often carrying notes of, well, stale pee. Walking past a dye workshop might subject you to sudden wafts of this hot, chemical, urinous vapor escaping from open windows or doorways. It was a different kind of bad from the tannery, less about decay and more about acrid, hot chemical fumes. Then there were the butchers and slaughterhouses. This is perhaps one of the easiest smells to conjure in your mind. Blood, gore, and offal. Animals were often slaughtered on site or nearby, and the process was messy. Blood would pool, guts were removed, and often simply discarded or poorly managed. And animal waste was abundant. The smell of fresh blood is metallic and heavy, but the smell of drying or decaying blood and offal is putrid and sickeningly sweet. Add to this the smell of animal droppings, the general miasma of live animals awaiting slaughter, and the flies that would inevitably be attracted to such a scene, and you had another potent zone of stench. Butchery was often located near markets where meat was sold, or sometimes concentrated in specific streets or areas. The proximity to food preparation, even if the food was meat, meant these smells permeated areas where people were buying and selling. Imagine trying to haggle over the price of a chicken while fighting the urge to gag from the smell of rotting entrails nearby. It certainly puts farm to table in a different light, doesn't it? Though, to be fair, your medieval butcher might try to keep the freshest meat prominent, hoping the smell of recent slaughter would overpower the smell of the bits they weren't quite so careful about. A quick joke: why did the medieval butcher make a bad comedian? Because all his jokes were awful. Badumts. Okay, maybe not that funny, but you get the idea. The smells were no laughing matter. Other crafts contributed their own distinct, often powerful smells. Soap makers, if they were rendering animal fats and boiling them with lye, would produce a greasy, acrid, slightly chemical smell, sometimes mixed with the underlying aroma of boiled animal tissue. Brewers and alewives generated the yeasty, fermenting smells of their trade, which, while not necessarily bad to everyone, could be thick and alcoholic, especially in warm weather. Fishmongers, unsurprisingly, smelled strongly of fish. Fresh, drying, and sometimes decidedly unfresh fish, depending on how long it had been sitting out. Imagine walking through a market street where one moment you're hit with the metallic tang of the butchers, the next the yeasty warmth of the bakers, a rare pleasant smell, followed by the sharp, briny, slightly decaying stink of the fish stall. It was an unpredictable, multi-layered assault on the nostrils. These craft-specific smells were often far more intense and localized than the general urban miasma. They were the result of chemical processes, biological decay, and the sheer volume of potentially offensive materials being handled in relatively confined spaces. There was no modern ventilation, no sealed containers for waste, and little understanding of how these emissions affected air quality or health. The waste products from these trades, the spent dye baths, the lime pits, the animal carcasses, and offal, were often simply dumped into the nearest river or stream, or added to the growing heaps of waste outside the city walls. This wasn't just an aesthetic problem, it severely polluted the water sources that the city relied on, creating a feedback loop of smell and potential disease. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to dyeing smells involves the use of certain natural dyes. While indigo from woad or blue dye from lichen might have specific scents, some processes used insects. For instance, the vibrant red cochineal dye, though more famous slightly later, involved grinding up vast quantities of dried insects. While the smell might not be as immediately repulsive as a tannery, imagine the faint, dusty, slightly sweet, but unsettling aroma of powdered bugs being processed in large quantities. It adds another layer to the complex olfactory tapestry of the medieval city. Not just decay and waste, but the smells of strange, organic chemical reactions. Historians still argue whether the clustering of these noxious trades was primarily a matter of practicality, access to water, needing space, needing to be away from others, or if it represented a deliberate social and spatial segregation based on the offensive nature of the work and the people who performed it. Were they pushed to the edges because they smelled bad? Or did they just need to be near the river and the smell was an accepted consequence? It's a classic chicken and egg historical puzzle, complicated by the fact that medieval people did have a sense of smell and did find these odors offensive, even if their tolerance was higher than ours. They created regulations, however ineffective, to manage the smells and waste, suggesting they weren't entirely oblivious or accepting. Think about being an apprentice in a tannery. Your clothes, your hair, your very skin would be permeated with the smell of urine, lime, and decaying hides. You couldn't wash it off easily, if at all. That smell would follow you home, to the market, to church. It wasn't just an occupational hazard. It was a social identifier, a constant, unavoidable broadcast of your trade. In a world where personal scent was often a battleground against the pervasive external stink, having a job that permanently branded you with one of the worst smells must have been a significant burden, both physically and socially. You didn't just do the smelly job, you became the smell of the job, a walking, talking advertisement for the pitch you worked over. It makes you appreciate deodorant in a whole new way, doesn't it? Or maybe just the fact that your worst work smell is stale coffee and office carpet, not several week-old dog dung. These localized zones of extreme stench were constant features of the medieval urban landscape. You learned where they were and, if possible, planned your routes to avoid walking directly through them, especially on a hot day. They were unavoidable facts of life, necessary evils for the production of essential goods like leather and cloth. They were a stark reminder that the seemingly simple items of everyday life, your shoes, your tunic, came from processes that were far from clean or pleasant. The beautiful dyed cloth wasn't just magic, it involved hot vats of questionable liquids. Your sturdy leather belt wasn't just cowhide. It was cowhide soaked in things you really don't want to think about too much. And you were living, breathing distance from it all, with nothing but a sleeve to hold over your nose. Or if you were lucky and rich, perhaps a pomander. So you've navigated the general urban pong, maybe dodged the specific industrial strength blasts from the tanneries or dyers. You might think you've experienced the worst the medieval city has to offer your nose. Bless your optimistic, modern heart, because we haven't even really talked about the single, most pervasive, utterly unavoidable, and intimately personal source of medieval urban stench: human waste. Your waste. Everyone else's waste. The sheer, unbelievable quantity of it in the rather casual approach to its disposal. Forget plumbing, forget flushing. Your primary tool for personal sanitation in a medieval city was the humble chamber pot, a simple ceramic or metal container, usually kept under the bed or in a corner. When nature called, you used the pot, and then came the inevitable question: what do you do with it? Well, if you were in a house without a privy or you simply couldn't be bothered to go to one, the easiest answer, the path of least resistance, was often the window. Yes, you heard that right. Open the window and yeet its contents onto the street below. This wasn't just a rare, desperate act. In many cities, it was a common practice, especially in densely populated areas or upper floors. Imagine walking down a narrow medieval street, the buildings leaning precariously towards each other overhead. effectively creating a smelly tunnel. You'd have to keep one ear open for a shout from above, a warning, sometimes in the local dialect, essentially meaning look out, poo incoming. In Edinburgh, the traditional cry was gardeloo, a corruption of the French garde l'eau, meaning watch out for the water. Though it wasn't just water, was it? You're constantly scanning the upper windows, trying to predict projectile trajectories. It adds a whole new layer of stress to a simple errand. The smell of fresh human waste, acidic and sharp, hitting the cobblestones, mingling with yesterday's deposits in the general street grime. It was a frequent, unavoidable occurrence. These discarded contents would flow down the middle of the street, often channeled into a central gutter or kennel that was supposed to carry away waste and rainwater. But these gutters were rarely effective, frequently blocked, and just became slow-moving rivers of filth. The smell rising from these open sewers was a constant, sickening tide. It was the smell of ammonia, hydrogen sulfide, and countless other delightful chemical compounds created by decomposing human excrement and urine. It clung to the air, seeped into the ground, and coated the street surfaces. Walking down a street after a mass emptying session, or just on any given afternoon, meant wading through air thick with the aroma of collective human output. It was the background radiation of medieval city life, a constant, low-frequency hum of pure yuck. Now, some wealthier homes, or those with a bit more space, might have a privy or a guardrobe. These were essentially small rooms or projections built onto the side of the house, with a hole or seat over a shaft. Where did the shaft lead? Ideally into a cesspit dug deep into the ground, or sometimes more conveniently, for the homeowner, less so for others, directly into a moat, a river, or even just the street or a nearby alley below. The smell from a private privy could be intense, especially in warmer weather. Even if the waste went into a pit, the shaft itself acted as a chimney, channeling the potent fumes upwards into the privy room and potentially into the main house if seals weren't good. Imagine trying to use the bathroom with the concentrated smell of a large, decomposing collection of waste just a few feet below you. It wasn't exactly a spa experience. The cesspits themselves were monumental sources of odor. These pits were designed to collect waste over long periods. Over time, the organic matter would decompose anaerobically, producing methane, hydrogen sulfide, and other incredibly smelly gases. The smell was thick, heavy, and deeply foul, the smell of stagnation and decay on a massive scale. These pits weren't emptied often, perhaps only every few years, or when they were overflowing. The job of emptying them fell to specialized workers known as gong farmers, or night soil men. This was one of the absolute worst jobs in the medieval city, and understandably so. They worked at night to minimize public disruption and probably exposure to the full horror, climbing down into these pits of accumulated human waste to shovel it out. The dangers were immense, not just the obvious risk of drowning in sewage or collapsing from the sheer stench, but also the very real danger of asphyxiation from the toxic gases, particularly methane, which could displace oxygen, and hydrogen sulfide, which is poisonous even at relatively low concentrations and famously smells like rotten eggs at lower levels, but can paralyze your sense of smell at higher lethal concentrations. A gong farmer might go down into a pit and never come back up. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that regulations often dictated when gong farmers could work, usually after dark, and where they had to take the waste, outside the city walls. In London, for instance, they were required to empty their carts of night soil far from the city center. But of course, that just moved the problem and created massive, stinking mounds of human waste in the surrounding countryside. The smell associated with gong farmers and their work was legendary. It was so bad they were often socially ostracized, their very presence a walking miasma of the pits they worked in. Their clothes, their skin, their hair, everything would be permeated with the smell of fermented, decaying human waste. Just imagine encountering one on the street, even from a distance, and being hit by that concentrated wave of pure, unadulterated offal. It makes you appreciate your sanitation workers in a profound way, doesn't it? Maybe leave out a small thank you note or something. Or at least don't complain about the bins. Even public spaces weren't immune. Some cities had public privies, but these were often just more communal versions of the private ones, emptying into a river or ditch and subject to the same buildup and lack of proper flushing. They were likely breeding grounds for disease and naturally sources of incredibly strong smells. Stepping into or even near a medieval public toilet would be an olfactory experience that you would likely never forget, for all the wrong reasons. It wasn't like walking into a slightly less than perfect modern public restroom. It was like walking into a festering wound. Historians still argue whether the health impacts of this widespread sanitation failure were fully understood by medieval people. While they clearly found the smells offensive and tried, sometimes to regulate waste disposal, hence rules for tanners, butchers, and gong farmers, it's debated whether they connected the smells directly to disease transmission in the way we do now. The prevailing theory of miasma, that disease was caused by bad air or noxious vapors, did link smell and illness, but the connection was more about the smell itself being the cause, rather than the smell indicating the presence of pathogens breeding in the waste. So they knew bad smells were unhealthy, but perhaps not why in the microbial sense. It's a nuanced point, but an open scholarly debate. Did they regulate smells for comfort in a vague sense of bad air? Or did they truly grasp, however instinctively, that the filth itself carried sickness? The sheer volume of waste generated by even a moderately sized medieval city was staggering. With no centralized collection or treatment system and limited options for disposal beyond dumping or pitting, the city was constantly struggling under a tide of its own effluent. Rainfall could wash some waste into rivers, polluting the water supply, a lovely feedback loop. But much of it remained on the streets, in yards, or accumulating in pits, perpetually decomposing and off-gassing. Think about a hot summer day. The heat would accelerate decomposition, intensifying all these smells. The smell of fermenting urine, decaying feces, industrial waste, animal carcasses, and general grime would hang heavy in the still air. You couldn't open a window for fresh air because the air outside was worse than the air inside. Your clothes would pick up the smell just from walking down the street. Your home, no matter how clean you tried to keep it, would be permeated by the external miasma. It was inescapable. It was the baseline reality. Compared to this, the smells we complain about today, exhaust fumes, overflowing bins waiting for collection, maybe a slight whiff from a sewage grate, are practically perfumed breezes. We live in a world where the removal and treatment of human waste is an invisible, automatic process happening underground and far away. We never have to think about the sheer volume of it or the process of dealing with it. Medieval people didn't have that luxury. Every time they used a chamber pot, every time they passed a cesspit, every time they walked down a street, they were confronted with the tangible, pungent reality of human existence and its less glamorous byproducts. It makes you look at your sparkling, clean toilet and think, wow, thank you, thank you, thank you. Maybe give it a little pat. It's doing a lot of heavy lifting that medieval streets couldn't handle. Here's a quick medieval plumbing joke for you. Why was the medieval man always tired? Because he kept hitting the hay while trying to empty his chamber pot out the window. Groan. Yeah, sorry, told you they were light jokes. But seriously, the effort involved in just dealing with basic human needs in that environment was significant. The constant presence of human waste smells also highlights the social hierarchy of smell. The poor and working classes living in smaller, less well-equipped homes were more likely to rely on chamber pots and street dumping. They also often lived in the most crowded, least sanitary areas. The wealthy might have privies, perhaps even slightly better maintained ones leading to a pit in their own garden. But even they couldn't escape the overall smell of the city. The wind blows after all. But the working poor were living, breathing, and waiting in it on a daily basis. Their clothes, their homes, their children would all carry the signature scent of urban poverty, which was inevitably the scent of human waste. It was a constant olfactory reminder of their place in the social order. You literally smelled like where you stood in society. So the next time you hear someone romanticize the medieval period, picturing knights in shining armor or fair maidens, just take a deep breath. Or maybe don't in this scenario. Just remember the chamber pots, the overflowing gutters, the gong farmers, and the pervasive, inescapable stench of a city drowning in its own biological output. It was a vibrant, bustling, fascinating place, yes, but it was also overwhelmingly a deeply, profoundly smelly one, with the aroma of human waste perhaps taking the top spot in the hierarchy of horrors. You really are lucky you can only imagine it. So you've just begun to appreciate the, shall we say, complexity of dealing with your own personal biological output in a medieval city, and everyone else's too. You've got the chamber pots, the street gutters running with gardyloo, the ominous whiff from a poorly placed privy shaft, and the truly industrial-grade horror of the gong farmer's bomb. It's a lot for one modern nose to handle, just the human part of the equation. But hold on to your, well, just hold on. Because the medieval city wasn't just home to people. It was also home to a surprisingly large and diverse population of animals, all contributing their own unique pungent notes to the overall urban symphony of stench. Picture this. You step out of your little half-timbered house, having just navigated the lingering aroma of yesterday's street-dumped chamber pot contents drying in the sun. You immediately encounter a new wave of smells. Perhaps it's the sharp, acidic tang of horse urine from a stable nearby, or the earthy, rank odor of pig manure from a sty in someone's yard. Maybe it's just the general, musky smell of damp animal fur and waste from bags or cats scavenging nearby. Medieval cities were surprisingly agrarian, even within their walls. People kept animals not just for work or transport, but for food and resources. Cows, pigs, chickens, geese, even sheep were not uncommon sights or smells within residential areas, often kept in small pens or yards right next to or behind houses. The smell of livestock manure is different from human waste, but no less potent. It's richer, earthier, sometimes sweeter in a deeply unpleasant way, depending on the animal's diet and the stage of decomposition. Fresh manure has one smell, older, wetter. Fermenting manure has another. The sheer volume generated by even a few animals could be significant. Imagine a city where many households kept a pig or two, a few chickens, maybe a cow or a horse. That's a lot of animal waste being deposited daily, often directly onto the ground in yards, pens, or even wandering freely in the streets. Horses were everywhere, of course, essential for transport, trade, and warfare. Stables, inns, and private homes with wealthy owners would house horses. A stable is, by its very nature, a source of intense smell. The sweet, heavy aroma of hay and feed mixes with the powerful, ammoniacal stench of horse urine soaking into bedding and the rich, earthy smell of horse manure piles. Add in the musky smell of sweaty horses just returned from a journey, and you have a concentrated zone of potent animal odor. Trying to get a good night's sleep above or near a busy medieval stable would be challenging, unless you were truly exhausted or had completely lost your sense of smell to the ambient air. Pigs were also common urban residents. They were often kept in small sties or even allowed to roam relatively freely, acting as informal garbage disposals, rooting through street refuse. A pigsty is famously smelly. Pigs wallow in mud and their own waste to stay cool, and their manure is particularly pungent. The smell of a pigsty is a deep, thick, cloying odor, a mix of decay, ammonia, and that distinct piggy smell. Seeing pigs snuffling through the muck in the street gutters was a common sight, and their presence added significantly to the overall level of filth and smell. It's hard to feel particularly clean or fresh when sharing your street with free-range swine acting as sanitation engineers. Chickens and geese, kept for eggs, meat, and feathers, added their own contributions. Chicken droppings are sharp and acrid, quickly building up in coops. The smell of a crowded chicken coop, especially in warm, damp conditions, is distinctive and not pleasant. Geese could add a particularly farmyard tang. These smaller animals might be kept in backyards, but the smells would still drift, adding to the general miasma. And then there were the less controlled animals. Stray dogs and cats, scavenging for food, would leave their own waste wherever they could. Rats and mice, thriving on the abundance of garbage and filth, would infest buildings and streets, leaving their droppings and contributing their own subtle or not so subtle when in large numbers. Rodent odor. The presence of so many animals, both domestic and wild, meant the city was not just a human environment, but a complex ecosystem where animal life and death were constantly interacting with the human population and constantly producing waste and smells. Beyond the smells of living animals and their everyday waste, there were the smells associated with processing animals for food and other resources. Slaughterhouses, butchers' stalls, tanneries, as we've touched on, and tallow chandlers, who made candles and soap from animal fat, were all major sources of smell, often located within or on the edge of the city. The smell of blood, particularly stale or drying blood, is a powerful, metallic, slightly sweet odor. The smell of animal guts and offal, especially as they begin to decompose, is incredibly foul, a mix of decay, ammonia, and fermentation. Slaughtering animals produces large amounts of waste: blood, entrails, bones, trimmings. While some parts were used, much was discarded. This waste would often be dumped into rivers, ditches, or simply piled up, creating putrid heaps that attracted flies and vermin and generated immense smells. Butcher shops, even if they weren't full slaughterhouses, dealt with raw meat, blood, and trimmings daily. The smell of fresh meat might not seem bad, but the residual odors, the small spills and scraps, and the constant presence of blood could lead to a persistent, slightly metallic, meaty smell, especially in warm weather. Add in the smell of flies buzzing around, charming. A quirky or fringe tidbit about urban animals. In some medieval cities, regulations were actually put in place regarding where certain animals could be kept or slaughtered, precisely because of the smell and filth. For instance, there are records from London and Paris attempting to ban butchers from slaughtering animals within the city walls or restricting where pigs could roam. This wasn't just about keeping the streets clear. It was a direct response to the olfactory and hygiene issues caused by these practices. However, enforcing these rules was difficult, and people often ignored them, prioritizing convenience or necessity over public sanitation, a concept that barely existed in the modern sense. So, while the idea of regulation was there, the reality on the ground often involved a lot of uncontrolled animal mess. The smell of decaying animal matter, whether intentional waste from slaughter or the unfortunate end of a stray dog, was a constant threat to the olfactory peace, such as it was. Carcasses left in the street or dumped in waterways would decompose rapidly, producing incredibly strong, sickening smells. The smell of rot, of putrefying flesh, is one of the most universally repulsive odors to humans, hardwired into us as a signal of danger and disease. Medieval city dwellers would have been routinely exposed to this smell, a grim reminder of mortality and decay right outside their door. Historians still argue whether the sheer number of animals living within the medieval city contributed more significantly to disease outbreaks than the human waste did. While human waste was a direct vector for diseases like dysentery and typhoid spread person to person, animals brought their own set of potential pathogens, parasites, and vectors, like fleas from rats, which carried the plague. Was the presence of so many animals, their waste, their bodies, the diseases they carried, the primary driver of urban unhealthiness? Or was it the accumulation of human waste, or perhaps the combination of both, exacerbated by poor water supply and general living conditions? It's an open scholarly debate, complex and intertwined, but the sensory reality was clear. Animals were a massive part of the urban smellscape, and likely a massive part of the urban health challenge. Consider the cumulative effect. You have the smell of human waste from chamber pots, privies, and gutters, mingling with the smells of animal manure from horses, pigs, and livestock. Add in the sharper smells from butcher stalls and slaughter waste, the greasy, fatty smells from tallow renders, the acrid smells from tanneries and dyers, many using animal products or byproducts, and the general smell of damp, dirt, and decay. It's an overwhelming assault on the senses, a dense layering of organic and industrial stenches. Walking through the city meant passing through zones with different dominant aromas, but all underpinned by this general pervasive animal-human industrial base. One minute you might be hit with the sharp ammonia of urine near a stable, the next the heavy richness of pig manure near a sty, followed by the metallic tang of blood near a butcher's. It was a constantly changing, yet always present, panorama of unpleasant smells. Let's lighten the mood slightly. Why did the medieval farmer bring a ladder to the slaughterhouse? Because he heard the stakes were high. Groan. Okay, that was worse than the chamber pot one. I'll try harder. Think about the contrast with modern cities. We still have animals, of course, pets, zoo animals, horses for leisure or police work, but they are far less integrated into the daily urban fabric. Animal waste is generally managed and collected and processed away from public view. Slaughterhouses are located outside residential areas, adhering to strict hygiene standards, relatively speaking. We don't have pigs roaming the streets cleaning up garbage, thankfully for the pigs and us. This separation of human life from animal life, particularly agricultural and waste-producing animal life, is a huge part of why our cities smell so different today. The presence of so many animals also meant more noise. The braying of donkeys, the grunting of pigs, the clucking of chickens, the barking of duem, the neighing of horses, and more flies attracted to the manure and waste, and more mud churned up by hooves and feet mixed with waste. It was a far messier, dirtier, noisier, and yes, much smellier environment than anything we are used to. The daily reality was one of constant interaction with animal life, their noises, their movements, and their smells. The air was thick, not just with human effluvia, but with the pungent breath of livestock, the dusty smell of their coats, the sweet, sickly odor of their urine and feces, the grim smell of their processing after death. It was a constant reminder that the city was a place of production and survival, not just dwelling, and that production involved getting very close to the messy realities of life and death for both humans and animals. So as you drift off, imagine yourself trying to navigate this environment. You're trying to buy some bread, dodging puddles of questionable origin, sidestepping a rooting pig, holding your breath as you pass a stable, and trying not to gag at the smell wafting from a nearby butcher's shop. It makes popping to your local supermarket feel like a trip to a sterile, scent-free paradise. The medieval city had a pulse, a vibrancy, a complexity, but oh, did it have a smell. And a large part of that smells came from its non-human residents in their messy, necessary presence. So you've bravely navigated the fragrant landscape of human effluent in the rich, earthy, and frankly often horrifying bouquet of animal waste within the medieval city limits. You've come to terms with the fact that just stepping outside meant confronting smells that would send you running for a gas mask today. But the urban smellscape wasn't just about biological output, yours or your furry, feathered, or hoofed neighbors. The medieval city was also a hive of activity, a place where goods were produced, crafts were practiced, and industries, small by modern standards but potent in their olfactory impact, churned out necessary items for daily life. And these industries added whole new layers of stench to the already complex atmospheric cocktail. Picture the scene again. You've just successfully avoided stepping in a particularly fresh pile of horse manure, and you're trying to breathe through your mouth as you pass a pigsty. Suddenly, the air changes. A new, sharp, acrid smell assaults your nostrils. It's overpowering, a mix of decay, chemicals, and something deeply unpleasant. You have likely stumbled upon the tanning district, or at least the workshop of a tanner. Tanning was absolutely essential in the Middle Ages. Leather was used for everything from shoes and belts to armor and bookbindings. But the process was spectacularly smelly. To tan animal hides, you first had to remove the hair and flesh. This was often done by soaking the hides in vats of lime, or more traditionally and notoriously, in vats of urine. Yes, urine. Human urine, collected from chamber pots, remember those? And public collection points. The ammonia in stale urine helped to loosen the hair and break down the fatty tissues on the hide. Imagine vats full of animal skins soaking in days-old warm urine under the summer sun. The smell was intensely ammoniac, combined with a heavy, decaying odor of rotting animal tissue. It was a smell that could make your eyes water and your stomach clench from a block away. After the urine or lime bath, The hides were scraped, then soaked in a solution containing tannins, often derived from bark. While the bark itself might smell earthy or woody, the entire operation with its raw hides, waste products, and stagnant liquids was a persistent, overwhelming source of foul odor. Tanneries were so notoriously smelly that they were often the target of regulations, being pushed to the edges of town or near rivers, which then became polluted. But they were rarely eliminated from urban life entirely because leather was so vital. Moving on, perhaps you encounter a different kind of industrial smell. A heavy, earthy, almost medicinal aroma mixed with something slightly sweet but also a bit rotten. You might be near a dyer's workshop. Dyeing cloth was another crucial urban industry. People wanted colored clothes, tapestries, and furnishings. But the dyes themselves and the processes used could be quite smelly. Natural dyes were derived from plants, insects, and even minerals. While some plant dyes might not have been too bad, others involved fermentation or required mordants, substances that helped the dye fix to the fabric. Alum was common, but other substances, including stale urine, again, or animal dung, were sometimes used as fixatives or mordants. Boiling large vats of fabric with natural dyes, and these fixatives produced vapors that, while perhaps colorful, were often far from fragrant. Some dyes, like those derived from certain lichens or fermented plant matter, had strong, pungent odors of their own. The smell of wet wool and linen soaking in these vats, combined with the reek of the chemicals and natural ingredients used, created a distinct and pervasive industrial smell. Beyond the wet, decaying smells of tanning and dyeing, other crafts added to the olfactory mix. Consider the blacksmith. While not as universally reviled for smell as tanners, blacksmiths produced significant smoke from their forges. Burning charcoal or coal released sulfurous fumes and general smoky odors into the air. The smell of hot metal, quenching in water, and the general gritty smell of soot and ash would hang around the smithy. Multiply that by several blacksmiths in one town, perhaps clustered together for convenience, and you have a persistent layer of smoky metallic smell underlying the biological ones. Then there were the tallow chandlers who made candles and soap from animal fat. This process involved rendering, melting down animal fat. Heated fat, especially large quantities being boiled and clarified, produces a heavy, greasy, distinct smell. Add to that the smell of the raw fat itself, often stored before processing, and the byproducts. Tallow rendering was another industry that contributed a rich, unctuous, and often unpleasant odor to the air, especially on cold days when the smell hung low. Think about food processing too, beyond just the butchers, which we touched on with animal smells. Fishmongers especially would deal with highly perishable goods. The smell of stale or outright rotting fish is universally recognized as awful. In a time without refrigeration, keeping fish fresh was a constant battle. Market-selling fish would inevitably smell strongly of the sea. Yes, but also of decay. The guts and trimmings would be discarded, adding to the problem. Similarly, bakers and brewers added smells. The comforting smell of baking bread in certain areas might be offset by the strong, yeasty, slightly sour smell of brewing beer, especially if spills or byproducts weren't handled well. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to these industrial smells involves perfume, or rather the medieval attempts to combat these smells. People in the Middle Ages were well aware their cities stank. While they didn't understand germ theory, they often associated bad smells, miasma, with disease. As a result, they developed practices and items aimed at masking or warding off these smells. Wealthy individuals might carry pomanders, small metal containers filled with fragrant substances like herbs, spices, or ambergris. A waxy substance from Wales, also quite smelly in its raw form, ironically but prized when aged, to hold up to their noses when passing through particularly foul-smelling areas. Or they might stuff fragrant herbs like rue, mint, or lavender into their clothes. The fact that people felt the need to carry personal air fresheners or stuff herbs into their sleeves just to walk down the street is a pretty telling indicator of the pervasive, unavoidable nature of the industrial and other smells. It wasn't about smelling nice. It was about trying not to gag. The cumulative effect of these industrial smells, layered onto the human and animal waste smells, was immense. Imagine walking down a street where the air conditioning is permanently broken, the sewage system is non-existent, and every third building houses a small factory producing incredibly strong chemical or decaying organic odors. You'd pass a tannery, get a blast of urine and decay. A few steps later, a dyer's workshop with the smell of boiling fabric and strange fixatives. Then maybe a blacksmith with smoke and sulfur, followed by a fishmonger with the smell of old fish. It was a constantly changing, localized assault on your sense of smell, contributing significantly to the overall background radiation of medieval urban stench. Industries were often located by rivers, not just because they needed water for processes like dyeing and tanning, but because the rivers could carry away the waste. This was a double-edged sword. It might slightly reduce the smell, right next to the workshop maybe, but it turned the river into an open sewer and chemical channel, polluting the primary source of water for many citizens further downstream. So you escaped the tannery smell only to add a whiff of the polluted river water someone might be trying to collect. Joy. The grouping of these industries also created smell vamos zones. You knew you were in the tannery district by the smell, just as you knew the fish market area. These zones were often correlated with the less desirable parts of town, though necessity meant smelly industries sometimes popped up surprisingly close to residential areas of varying wealth. Historians still argue whether the environmental pollution generated by these medieval industries, particularly tanneries and dyers dumping waste into rivers, had a significant long-term impact on the health of urban populations beyond the immediate smell. While the smell was terrible and arguably associated with disease via the miasma theory of the time, quantifying the specific health effects of chemical runoff or air pollution from pre-industrial processes is challenging. Did the pollutants weaken people, making them more susceptible to other diseases? Or were the direct vectors, like contaminated water from human waste, the primary killers? It's an open scholarly debate involving archaeology, analysis of historical records, and sometimes even forensic examination of remains for trace elements, trying to untangle the complex web of factors affecting health in this incredibly unhealthy environment. Let's try a joke. Why did the blacksmith break up with the baker? Because she was always loafing around and he preferred the daily grind. Crickets. Okay, that was also pretty bad. Maybe the smells are affecting my sense of humor. Think about the difference today. Most of these processes are either obsolete, vastly changed, or moved to industrial estates far from residential areas, with strict pollution controls, ideally. We don't have large vats of urine soaking animal hides in our city centers. Our dyeing processes are chemical-based and contained. Meat and fish are processed in facilities meeting hygiene standards we can barely imagine compared to the Middle Ages. The separation of living space from production space and the vastly improved waste disposal and pollution control methods are fundamental differences that explain why our cities don't have that pervasive, multi-layered industrial stink. The constant presence of these industrial smells meant that the air in a medieval city was rarely, if ever, fresh or clean. It was thick with the byproducts of essential crafts and trades, a constant reminder of the messy, hands-on nature of production. It required a certain level of desensitization, a turning off of the most acute olfactory responses, just to get through the day without feeling perpetually nauseous. You might get used to it in the way you get used to a background noise, but it was always there. And every so often, a strong gust of wind or a change in humidity would bring a particularly potent wave from a nearby tannery or fish stall, and you'd be reminded just how truly awful it could be. Trying to find a moment of truly clean air, free from human waste, animal smells, and industrial effluvia would have been incredibly difficult within the city walls. Maybe on a high tower on a very windy day or just outside the city gate, though even then, the air might carry smells from fields or passing carts. The city was a self-contained ecosystem of smells, constantly generating new ones from its inhabitants, their animals, and their work. And as you process the layers of foulness, biological, agricultural, industrial, you started to understand just how fundamentally different the sensory experience of living in a medieval city was compared to your own. The air you breathe today, even in a busy modern city, is a pristine, scent-free miracle compared to the reality of back then. So you've survived the stench of human effluent, animal mess, and the chemical, biological assault of urban industries like tanning and dyeing. You've learned that just existing in a medieval city was an olfactory endurance test. But the city wasn't just about waste and work. It was also about sustenance, commerce, and gathering. And that brings us to another major contributor to the overwhelming medieval smellscape, the markets and the smells of food, both fresh and inevitably not so fresh. Imagine you're moving away from the cluster of tanneries, the acrid, decaying smell starting to fade slightly, replaced by a different kind of density in the air. You're heading towards the central marketplace, the heart of urban life. This is where goods changed hands, news was exchanged, and the diverse products of the surrounding countryside and urban crafts converged. And the smells here, oh, they were a symphony, or perhaps more accurately, a cacophony of aromas, layered and often conflicting. As you approach the market square, the first thing that hits you might be a pervasive, heavy sweetness, mixed with earthiness and something faintly sour. This could be from the fruit and vegetable stalls. Piles of apples, pears, plums, depending on the season, would release their sugars into the air. Root vegetables like carrots, turnips, and parsnips would add an earthy note. Cabbages, always a staple, would contribute a slightly sulfurous, dense smell, especially if bruised or past their prime. But without refrigeration, ripe produce quickly turns to overripe, then to rot. So underlying the sweet and earthy smells would be the unmistakable, unpleasant aroma of decay, particularly pungent with fruits and greens starting to ferment or decompose in the heat. Then comes the meat market. If the tanneries dealt with the hides, the butchers dealt with the carcasses. Slaughterhouses were often nearby, or animals might even be slaughtered directly in or next to the market. The smell of raw meat, blood, and offal would be strong and metallic. Butchers would hack and cleave joints in the open air, the waste products like guts, bones, and trimmings piling up quickly, attracting flies and scavengers. Without proper chilling, meat spoiled rapidly, especially in warmer weather. The smell of decaying flesh, sweet and sickeningly foul, would mingle with the fresher smells, creating a nauseating combination. Imagine the smell of a hot, busy modern butcher shop crossed with a landfill, but less regulated. That's closer to the reality. Mainstream historical fact: butchering was a highly skilled trade, but the sanitary conditions under which it was often practiced in medieval markets were incredibly primitive by modern standards, leading to rapid spoilage and significant public health risks. And then there were the fish markets. We touched on this briefly with industrial smells because fishmongers discarded waste, but the market itself was a smell zone of its own. As we discussed, fresh fish already has a distinct smell, but medieval fish markets, especially those trading in herring or other common fish, would be dominated by the increasingly strong, pungent odor of fish that was no longer fresh. Salting and smoking were used for preservation, adding their own aromas, salty, smoky, sometimes acrid. But unsold fish, or fish that hadn't been properly preserved or kept cool, often just packed in reed baskets, maybe with some ice harvested from ponds in winter, if available, would decompose rapidly, releasing that unmistakable, eye-watering smell of rotting fish. Piles of fish guts and scales left lying around didn't help. The fish market was arguably one of the most viscerally unpleasant smelling places in any medieval city, a constant reminder of the battle against decay in a pre-refrigeration world. Beyond the raw produce and meat, you'd find vendors selling prepared food. Bakers might have small stalls, the smell of warm bread offering a brief, pleasant respite from the surrounding funk. Butchers might sell cooked meat pies or sausages. Vendors would offer pottages, stews or thick soups, cooked beans or other ready-to-eat items. These cooking smells, the aroma of boiling meat and vegetables, frying fat, baking pastry, would add layers of complexity to the market air. However, open-air cooking over wood fires or charcoal braziers would also contribute smoke and the smell of rendered fat, often becoming greasy and heavy in the air. And you had to wonder about the provenance and age of the ingredients going into these prepared meals. Were they using the freshest ingredients or trying to cook up stuff that was slightly past its prime to avoid waste? You could probably tell by the smell if you dared to inhale too deeply. The markets weren't just about food, of course. There were stalls selling textiles, spices, leather goods, maybe from those smelly tanneries nearby, metalwork, and 1,000 other things. The spice vendors would offer intoxicating aromas of cloves, cinnamon, pepper, ginger, and exotic resins. A small oasis of intense, pleasant fragrance in the general stink. The smell of wool and linen, sometimes treated with urine or other substances during production, would add a musky, animalistic note. Leather goods would carry the distinctive smell of finished leather, hopefully less offensive than the raw hides at the tannery, but still present. Overlaying all these specific market smells was the pervasive scent of the crowd itself. The smell of unwashed bodies, sweat, stale breath, perhaps even illness. People packed together in a relatively confined space, engaged in commerce and gossip, would generate a significant collective human smell. Add to that the dust kicked up from the unpaved ground, the occasional animal present, a merchant's horse or a farmer's cart, and you had a dynamic, constantly shifting olfactory experience that was rarely, if ever, clean or pure. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to medieval market smells involves the perception of scent and status. While the markets were generally smelly places, access to exotic spices and perfumes, like those in Pomanders, was a mark of wealth and status. The ability to mask the common smells of decay and waste with expensive fragrances wasn't just about comfort, it was a social signal. Imagine someone strolling through the fish market, holding a silver pomander filled with civet or musk to their nose. That wasn't just someone avoiding a bad smell. That was someone broadcasting their ability to afford such luxuries, a fragrant boundary between them and the malodorous masses. It highlights how intertwined smell was with social hierarchy and the very real challenges of simply existing comfortably in the medieval urban environment. Think about the waste generated in the market, all those discarded fruit peels, vegetable trimmings, meat offal, fish guts, broken baskets, and general rubbish. Where did it go? Often it was left to pile up in the market square during the day, maybe swept into heaps at the end of the day, and then, well, sometimes collected, sometimes left for pigs or dogs to scavenge, sometimes just adding to the general detritus that permeated the city's ground and air. Rain would turn the unpaved market square into a muddy, foul-smelling quagmire, where the smells of decay and waste were literally underfoot, kicked up with every step. Historians still argue whether the medieval market's role in spreading disease was primarily due to the unsanitary conditions and resulting smells, the miasma theory view, prevalent at the time, or due to the concentration of people and goods facilitating the spread of pathogens through touch, breath, and contaminated food and water. The germ theory view, which we understand now but wasn't known then. While we know now that bad smells don't cause disease directly, the conditions that created those smells, accumulated waste, spoiled food, crowded and unsanitary environments, were breeding grounds for bacteria and vectors for illness. So while the smell itself wasn't the killer, it was a potent indicator of conditions that absolutely contributed to high mortality rates in urban areas. It's an open scholarly debate how much impact the perception of miasma had on public health behaviors versus the actual impact of the underlying unsanitary conditions. Let's try another joke. What do you call a medieval baker who's always complaining? A sourdough. Okay, I'll stick to the smells. The sheer density and variety of odors in the market were staggering. On a single walk through, you could encounter the sickening sweetness of rotting fruit, the metallic tang of blood from the butcher, the eye-watering ammonia of decaying fish, the greasy smell of cooked food, the earthy smell of fresh vegetables, the dusty smell of grain, the spicy aroma of imports, and the ever-present background noise of general human and urban grime. It was a place where all the different threads of the city's smellscape seemed to converge and amplify each other. Contrast this with a modern supermarket. The smells are carefully controlled. Produce is refrigerated, meat is packaged and chilled, fish is on ice, and decay is minimized through rapid turnover and hygiene. The primary smells are often manufactured ones, the faint scent of cleaning products, maybe a dedicated bakery section pumping out the smell of fresh bread, or strategically placed flower displays. The overwhelming smell is one of relative neutrality and cleanliness, a deliberate contrast to the sensory overload of the medieval market. You certainly wouldn't find piles of fish guts left on the floor or rotting fruit attracting swarms of flies. The market, therefore, wasn't just a place of transaction. It was a major olfactory landmark in the medieval city. Its smells were dynamic, changing with the season, the weather, the time of day, and the specific goods being sold. It was a place where the bounty of the land met the realities of preservation and decay in a world without modern sanitation and refrigeration. And like the smells of waste and industry, the smells of the market were unavoidable, a fundamental part of the sensory experience of urban life that you had to navigate, breathe through, and ultimately adapt to. You learned to hold your breath, to walk quickly past certain stalls, and perhaps, if you were lucky or wealthy, to carry your own small source of pleasant aroma to offer a brief, insufficient barrier against the onslaught. Leaving the vibrant, if olfactorily challenging, chaos of the market square, you might find yourself wondering about the smells not just of the city, but inside its buildings. If the streets and markets were assaults on your senses, what waited for you behind closed doors? Surely domestic spaces offered a refuge from the external reek, a place to breathe easier, right? Well, maybe a little, but not as much as you'd hope. Medieval homes had their own distinct spectrum of smells, varying wildly depending on who lived there, how wealthy they were, and the construction of the building itself. For the vast majority of the population, the artisans, laborers, small merchants, homes were often simple, one or two room affairs. The main feature and the source of many smells was the hearth. This wasn't just for cooking, it was the primary source of heat, light, and often the central gathering point. The constant burning of wood, peat, or even dried animal dung for fuel filled the air with smoke. In homes without proper chimneys, which was common especially in earlier periods or for poorer dwellings, the smoke would simply filter out through an opening in the roof or just hang in the air before slowly dissipating. So a perpetual smell of wood smoke, sometimes thick and acrid, would cling to everything. The walls, the furniture, your clothes, your hair. You'd breathe it in constantly. Beyond the smoke, consider the floors. Often floors were simply packed earth or covered with rushes or straw. This might sound cozy, maybe even slightly rustic chic, but these rushes were rarely changed. Instead, new layers were simply piled on top of old ones. Think about everything that might fall onto a floor over days, weeks, or even months. Spilled food and drink, animal droppings, if animals shared the space, which they often did in poorer homes. Dirt and grime tracked in from the streets, and potentially human waste if chamber pots were emptied carelessly or broken. The lower layers of rushes would decompose, becoming damp, moldy, and a breeding ground for vermin and insects. The smell of stale, damp, decaying organic matter mixed with whatever had been spilled or dropped onto it was a constant undercurrent in many medieval homes. It's the kind of smell that gets into the very fabric of the building. And then there are the occupants themselves. Personal hygiene wasn't what we consider standard today. While bathing was known and practiced by some, especially in towns with public bathhouses, which we'll get to, daily full-body washing with soap wasn't common for everyone. Clothes were also not laundered with the frequency or effectiveness of modern times. So the smell of unwashed bodies, sweat, and soiled clothing would contribute to the general atmospheric bouquet inside the home. Add to that the smell of breath, particularly in crowded conditions, and you have a pervasive, human-centric scent layer. Cooking added its own aromas, of course. Simple pottages made from vegetables, grains, and maybe a bit of meat or broth would simmer over the fire for hours, filling the house with the smell of boiling cabbage, beans, and whatever else was available. If you were better off, you might roast meat, adding the smell of sizzling fat and cooked flesh. Without strong ventilation, these cooking smells would linger, mingling with the ever-present smoke and the smells from the floor. Imagine cooking a big pot of lentil soup with questionable ingredients over an open fire in a small, smoky room with a damp, dirty floor covered in old straw. That was dinner time, smell-wise, for many. Let's talk about animals. In many lower-status homes, animals like chickens, pigs, or even a cow might share part of the living space, especially in winter. This was both for security and to benefit from the animal's body heat. The smells associated with the animals, manure, urine, damp straw, their general animalness, would be an integral part of the home's smellscape. Even without livestock inside, rats, mice, and other pests attracted by food scraps and unsanitary conditions would contribute their own musky, urine-soaked smells, moving up the social ladder to the homes of wealthier merchants, craft masters, or minor gentry. The smells might change, but they didn't necessarily disappear entirely. These houses were larger, often multi-story, and might have specific rooms for different purposes. They were more likely to have actual chimneys, which helped vent some of the smoke from the hearth. Those smoky rooms were still common. Floors might be tiled or wooden, though rushes could still be used, sometimes changed more frequently or mixed with sweet-smelling herbs. Wealthier homes also dealt with waste, but perhaps differently. They might have garderobes, essentially a stone shaft built into the wall, often emptying into a cesspit or even a moat below. While technically a privy, these certainly weren't smell-free. The smell of accumulated human waste would waft up the shaft and into the small room. Better than a chamber pot spilled onto the floor, perhaps, but still a significant source of bad odor within the house itself. Chamber pots were still used in bedrooms, and while presumably emptied more regularly by servants, they were a constant potential source of foul smells. Despite having more space and stuff, the fundamental lack of running water and modern sanitation meant certain smells were unavoidable. Even in a grand house, cooking smells lingered from the kitchen, often a separate building or on a different floor, but smells travel. Candle wax or lamp oil smoke. Wealthier homes used beeswax candles, which smelled better than tallow, but still produced smoke. The smell of stored goods, like furs, dried herbs, spices, grain, and the unavoidable smells related to the body and its functions persisted. Mainstream historical fact. Even in wealthy homes, bathing was often infrequent by modern standards and typically involved large, portable tubs of heated water, making it a time-consuming and labor-intensive process rather than a quick daily routine. However, wealthy households had ways to try and combat the bad smells. They used sweet-smelling herbs scattered on floors, lavender, mint, chamomile, hung sachets of dried flowers, used perfumes, and burned incense. Remember those spice merchants in the market? Wealthy folks could afford to buy imported spices and resins like frankincense and myrrh, not just for cooking, but for scenting their homes or carrying in pomanders. These intentional, pleasant smells created pockets of olfactory relief, distinguishing these homes from the generally more pungent air of the poor. It was a form of fragrant interior design, albeit one fighting an uphill battle against the underlying medieval reality. A quirky or fringe tidbit relates to medieval beliefs about air and health. The concept of miasma, bad air-carrying disease, was widely accepted. Because of this, people in wealthier homes might actively try to purify the air using fragrant smoke from burning herbs or incense, believing they were warding off illness as well as masking bad smells. Sometimes they would even open windows to air out rooms, but they might be hesitant to do so if the air outside was perceived as particularly foul or unhealthy, for example, during an epidemic, ironically trapping stagnant, smelly air inside. This highlights the often misguided attempts to improve conditions based on the limited scientific understanding of the time. Historians still argue whether the relative comfort and space in wealthier homes genuinely translated into significantly better health outcomes compared to poorer dwellings, or if the fundamental lack of sanitation and pervasive urban miasma meant everyone was equally susceptible to disease, just maybe smelling slightly better while they got sick. While better nutrition and less strenuous labor certainly played a role in the longevity of the wealthy, The impact of housing conditions and hygiene, or lack thereof, on urban health remains a complex and debated topic among scholars. Another thing to consider is how materials smelled. New wood, old wood, plaster, stone, thatch, all have their own base smells. Over time, these materials absorb the pervasive sense of smoke, damp, and use. Imagine the smell of old, smoke-blackened timbers, damp stone walls, and a straw roof that might occasionally leak. It all contributed to the unique olfactory signature of a medieval building. Let's lighten the mood slightly. Why did the medieval house smell bad at cards? Because it had terrible body odor. Okay, that was a bit of a stretch, even for me. How about this one? What's a medieval ghost's favorite room in the house? The boudoir. Right, moving on. The constant presence of moisture was also a key factor in home smells. Lack of proper foundations, leaky roofs, and inadequate drainage meant damp and mildew were common problems, especially in certain seasons. The musty, earthy smell of damp would permeate walls and furnishings, providing a perfect environment for mold growth, adding that specific, unpleasant odor to the mix. This was particularly true for homes built of less durable materials or those not well maintained. Even stored food contributed. Grain stored in sacks, dried meat or fish hanging from rafters, cheeses ripening, all added their specific aromas, sometimes pleasant, sometimes less so, depending on freshness and storage conditions. Pantries and storerooms might smell of flour, spices, smoked goods, and potentially, if pests got in, something else entirely. The experience inside a medieval home was a microcosm of the city's larger smellscape, filtered through the lens of domestic life. It was less overwhelming than the market or the industrial areas, perhaps, but it was constant and intimate. These were the smells you woke up to, ate your meals with, and went to sleep, surrounded by. They were the smells of existence in a world without air fresheners, exhaust fans, or regular deep cleaning as we know it. You didn't just live in your house, you lived within its smell bubble. Comparing it to a modern home is stark. Today, we expect our homes to smell neutral, perhaps with a faint hint of cleaning products or a deliberate scent from a candle or diffuser. We actively remove sources of odor through ventilation, plumbing, refrigeration, and regular cleaning. The very idea of sharing living space with livestock or having decomposing rushes on the floor is unthinkable. Medieval homes, in contrast, were dynamic olfactory environments where the smells of daily life, decay, and attempts at cleanliness constantly wrestled for dominance. The smells inside your home were a direct reflection of your status, your activities, and the fundamental challenges of living in a pre-industrial, pre-sanitation era. It makes you appreciate the miracle of indoor plumbing and weekly trash collection in a whole new nostril-clearing way. Leaving the intimate, layered smells of the medieval home, perhaps you're hoping for a breath of fresh air or, at the very least, a chance to wash off some of the accumulated grime and odor. If you were a person of means or lived in a city that maintained such facilities, your thoughts might turn to the public bathhouse. These weren't the sleek, tiled, individual cubicles of a modern spa. Medieval bathhouses were often communal affairs, steamy rooms filled with large tubs or pools where people gathered to soak, socialize, and potentially get a bit cleaner. The experience of entering a medieval bathhouse would have been a sensory event in itself. First, the heat and humidity hitting you as you step through the door, a stark contrast to the often cool, damp air outside. The air inside would be thick with steam, carrying the mingled scents of heated water, wood smoke from the fires heating the boilers, and unavoidably, the bodies of the people already present. It wasn't always a scent of pure cleanliness, not by modern standards. The water heated laboriously over fires might not have been changed frequently throughout the day, especially in busier or less well-managed establishments. So the smell could quickly acquire notes of stale water and accumulated human effluents. Despite this, bathhouses represented one of the primary opportunities for many people to engage in something resembling a full-body wash. For those without access to private heating facilities or the means to heat large quantities of water at home, the public bath was a crucial amenity. You might strip down, perhaps not always fully, depending on local customs and the specific bathhouse. Slip into a large tub or pool shared with others and soak away some of the day's dirt. Services might be available, like attendants who would scrub you down, or masseurs. Some bathhouses even offered food, drink, and entertainment, making them social hubs as much as places of hygiene. Imagine trying to have a relaxing soak while someone next to you is loudly discussing trade prices and someone else is attempting to juggle loaves of bread. Multitasking relaxation, medieval style. However, the reputation and prevalence of public baths waxed and waned throughout the medieval period and across different regions. In some early medieval towns, they were quite common, a legacy of Roman bathing culture. By the later Middle Ages, their numbers declined in many parts of Europe, particularly in the north. Several factors contributed to this. One was the fear of disease transmission, especially as plagues and other epidemics swept through populations. The close communal quarters of a bathhouse seemed like a perfect breeding ground for illness, a suspicion that wasn't entirely unfounded, given the lack of understanding of germ theory, but accurate in practice. Another factor was moral objections. Some saw bathhouses, particularly those offering additional services beyond just washing, as sites of vice and promiscuity. This moral panic certainly didn't help their public image or encourage authorities to maintain them. Beyond full immersion, personal care involved other practices. Hair was washed, though perhaps not daily. The method would involve water and possibly some form of lye or plant-based soap, which could be harsh. Barbers played a significant role in personal grooming. They didn't just cut hair and shave faces. Barber surgeons were also responsible for rudimentary medical procedures, including bleeding, wound dressing, and even basic dental work. Visiting the barber might involve getting your hair trimmed, a shave, and perhaps having a tooth extracted. Quite the all-in-one appointment. The smell of the barber shop would likely be a mix of cut hair, blood, less frequently, hopefully, or herbs used as poultices, and perhaps some attempts at air freshening. Dental hygiene was rudimentary. People might clean their teeth by rubbing them with rough cloths or using chewing sticks made from specific woods. Herbal concoctions or powders were sometimes used to freshen breath, though the effectiveness of these varied wildly. Given diets often high in starches and lacking modern dental care, bad breath was likely a common issue. Mainstream historical fact: while toothbrushes as we know them didn't exist, people in the Middle Ages used various methods like rubbing teeth with rough linen or using herbal mixtures for cleaning and freshening breath, indicating an awareness, however limited, of the importance of oral hygiene. To combat the ever-present assault of less than pleasant smells, both personal and environmental, people turned to perfumes and scented substances. This was particularly true for the wealthy who could afford imported ingredients. Perfumes were made from a variety of sources, including flowers like rose, violet, lily, herbs, rosemary, lavender, spices, cinnamon, clove, resins, frankincense, myrrh, and animal products. A quirky or fringe tidbit: some highly prized perfume ingredients came from animal sources, like musk from the musk deer, civet from the civet cat, or ambergris, a waxy substance from the digestive system of sperm whales often found floating in the ocean. Yes, medieval people were sometimes dabbing whale vomit behind their ears, if they were fancy enough. These perfumes and scents weren't just for vanity, they were also used because of the prevailing belief in miasma theory, the idea that bad smells cause disease. Smelling something pleasant, especially something powerful like frankincense or expensive perfumes, was thought to ward off illness by purifying the air around you. People carried pomanders, perforated containers holding fragrant substances, or wore scented gloves. Wealthier individuals might even have their clothes cleaned or stored with fragrant herbs or spices. These deliberate, artificial scents added another layer to the medieval smellscape, creating small idong-ganunghan bubbles of pleasantness that contrasted sharply with the surrounding olfactory chaos. Civic efforts to manage the city's smells were, for the most part, limited and often ineffective. City authorities were certainly aware that bad smells were unpleasant and potentially unhealthy. Again, miasma theory. They passed regulations attempting to control where noxious trades like tanning, which use foul-smelling chemicals in animal hides, or butchery could operate, often pushing them to the outskirts of the city or along rivers where waste could theoretically be carried away. There were also attempts to regulate the dumping of waste in streets and public areas, imposing fines on offenders. However, the fundamental lack of infrastructure made these regulations difficult to enforce or truly effective. Without proper sewers, running water to flush streets, and organized waste collection, waste disposal remained a massive challenge. The regulations were often reactive rather than preventative, and the scale of the problem frequently overwhelmed the authorities' capacity to deal with it. Public conduits or wells provided sources of water, but these were often located downstream from sources of pollution or were themselves susceptible to contamination, adding another layer of risk and potential odor. Historians still argue whether the decline of public baths in many areas was primarily driven by the very real fear of disease spreading in communal spaces, or whether changing social attitudes towards privacy and cleanliness, possibly influenced by religious or moral reforms, played a more significant role. It's a complex interplay of public health fears, evolving social norms, and potentially economic factors that led to the disappearance of these ancient institutions in some places, leaving personal cleanliness even more dependent on private means or rudimentary home methods. Let's try a quick one. Why did the medieval guy bring a ladder to the bathhouse? Because he heard the water was deep end. Up. Okay, stretching for bath jokes here. What do you call a medieval barber who tells jokes? A sheer delight. One more. Why did the medieval deodorant fail? Because it only worked in ode times. The ability to acquire or create pleasant smells was a mark of status. The poor might try to use common herbs like mint or rosemary, or perhaps lavender if they could grow it. The wealthy could afford exotic spices, imported resins, and animal musk. Even attempts at cleanliness, having water heated for a bath, affording soap, often made from animal fat and lye, and not always pleasant smelling itself, or paying a barber, were tied to economic status. So while everyone in the medieval city was subjected to its pervasive smells, their personal smell and the smells of their immediate surroundings were often a silent indicator of their place in society. Thinking about these attempts at cleanliness, both personal and civic, you realize how much they were fighting against the tide. The sheer volume of waste, the lack of infrastructure, the limited understanding of hygiene and disease transmission meant that even the most diligent efforts were often insufficient by modern standards. Bathing was an occasional event, not a daily habit. Perfumes masked rather than eliminated odors. Regulations were difficult to enforce. It's a stark reminder that the relatively odor-free environment many of us inhabit today is a very recent historical development, built on centuries of infrastructure development, scientific understanding, and evolving social norms around personal hygiene. The pursuit of cleanliness in the medieval city was a constant, challenging battle against the forces of decay and dirt, a battle primarily experienced through the nose. So you've got the general idea, the pervasive stink of medieval city life, a concoction of human and animal waste, garbage, and industrial effluvium, all simmering under whatever sky happened to be overhead that day. But it wasn't uniformly that smell everywhere. Like any modern city has its fresh bakery smells near one corner and questionable dumpster aromas down an alley, the medieval city had its olfactory hotspots, places where the general reek intensified into something truly memorable, places you might actively try to avoid, or at least hold your breath when passing. Step into the market square, for instance. At first glance, it's a chaotic symphony of sights and sounds. Merchants shouting, customers haggling, the clatter of goods. But close your eyes or maybe keep them open, it might be safer, and just smell. The air here is different. It's a richer, more complex layering of decay than the general street musk. You'll find the mingled aromas of spilled produce rotting underfoot, the sweet, heavy scent of bruised fruit, the sharp tang of wilting vegetables. Juices from overloaded carts seep into the packed earth. Then there's the livestock section. If animals are sold here, you've got the fresh, pungent smell of straw, mixed with urine and manure, compressed by countless hooves and feet. Butchers are often near the market or integrated into it. Their stalls bring the sharp metallic smell of fresh blood, mingling with the sickly sweet scent of entrails and offal that haven't been cleared away quickly enough. Even in cooler weather, decomposition starts surprisingly fast. And the fish market? Oh, the fish market. Even in modern times, a fish market can be a potent sensory experience. Imagine one without refrigeration, without ice as we know it, where fish caught hours or even days ago are laid out in the open, often just on wooden tables or woven mats. The smell is an aggressive assault of brine and rot, the sharp ammoniac decay of fish guts in scales left behind, clinging to the air, the ground, everything. It's a smell that gets into your clothes, your hair, your very pores. It's a smell that announces the presence of the fish market from blocks away, often long before you can see it. Butchers and slaughterhouses, if located within the city walls, and they often were for convenience, were perhaps the apex predators of the smellscape. Picture the scene: animals brought in, slaughtered on site. Blood flows freely onto the ground, attracting swarms of flies. Carcasses are dismembered, producing vast quantities of waste: bones, organs, fat trimmings, hides. While valuable parts were used, much was discarded. This refuse, piled up before being carted away or just left, created a powerful stench of death and decay. The air around a slaughterhouse wasn't just smelly, it felt heavy, viscous, saturated with the processes of death and disintegration. It makes the general street smell seem almost charmingly mild by comparison. It's here you truly appreciate the phrase, sickening smell. Waterways too served as convenient, albeit heavily polluted, disposal sites. Rivers and streams flowing through cities often receive the brunt of waste from households, tanneries, dyers, butchers, and anyone else near the bank. What might have entered the city as relatively clean water exited downstream as a foul, murky soup laden with organic matter, chemicals, and pathogens. Walking along the banks of such a river, the smell was a concentrated version of the city's worst elements, amplified by the dampness and the movement of the water stirring up sediment. It was a smell that spoke of contamination, of a vital resource turned into a sewer. Historians still argue whether the cumulative effect of polluting urban rivers significantly shortened lifespan in cities compared to rural areas, or if other factors like diet and housing were more critical. The connection between bad smells, miasma, and sickness was understood, but the true vector of disease, germs in contaminated water, air, or food, was not. Public latrines were a mixed blessing. Where they existed, often near gates or major public buildings, they offered an alternative to street dumping. However, they were typically shallow pits or simple structures emptying into a ditch, with no running water for flushing. They were used by many people throughout the day, and imagine the state of a public toilet pit at the end of a busy day or week, especially in warm weather. The smell emanating from these locations would be intense, a concentrated blast of ammonia and methane. While they might have slightly reduced the mess on the main streets near them, they created their own potent zones of concentrated filth and stench. Not exactly a refreshing pit stop. Consider specific times too. Hot weather intensified all these smells. Decomposition speeds up dramatically in heat, and evaporation carries smelly, volatile compounds further and faster. A scorching summer day in a medieval city would have been an absolute olfactory nightmare. Rain could offer a temporary respite by washing some surface filth away, but it often stirred up deeper muck and turned the already questionable ground into a slurry of mud and manure, potentially making things even smellier overall. Floods, or simply periods of high groundwater, could be disastrous, bringing the contents of cesspits and buried refuse closer to the surface or even into homes. Mass gatherings like religious festivals, market days, or public executions would also exacerbate the smell problem. More people, more animals, more activity, more waste produced in a short period, overwhelming the already inadequate systems for disposal. Imagine a large crowd packed into a small space, everyone sweating, animals nearby, waste accumulating rapidly. It adds a layer of intense body odor and concentrated environmental nastiness to the general atmosphere. It makes you appreciate having personal space indoor plumbing, and deodorant, doesn't it? You can almost smell the combined anxiety and body odor of hundreds crammed into a square, waiting for something gruesome to happen. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to dealing with this involves personal attempts to mask or combat the smells. While the rich might burn sweet-smelling herbs or wear perfumes, often heavy ones, perhaps intentionally, ordinary people had fewer options. Some sources suggest people might carry small sachets of herbs or flowers, like posies, to hold to their noses when passing particularly foul areas. This practice, it is often associated with later periods in times of plague, thought to ward off the miasma. But the basic idea of using strong, pleasant smells to counteract unpleasant ones would have been intuitive. Imagine everyone walking around with a little bunch of lavender or rue pressed to their face. Not exactly comfortable, but perhaps necessary for survival in certain locations. It's the medieval equivalent of holding your shirt collar over your nose when you walk past a dumpster fire. Despite the pervasive smell and the obvious connection between filth and disease, even if the mechanism wasn't understood, attempts at municipal sanitation were often reactive and limited. There were regulations in some places against specific practices, like throwing waste directly out of windows onto people below, though, as noted, enforcement was spotty, or against butchers slaughtering animals in the middle of the main streets. Some cities hired rakers or scavengers, the gong farmers mentioned before, to clear refuse from major thoroughfares. But they were often few in number, and their work was sporadic. The sheer volume of waste produced daily far outstripped the capacity of these nascent urban services. It was like trying to empty a bathtub with a thimble while the tap was running full blast. This lack of effective, large-scale sanitation is a key reason why medieval cities were such potent breeding grounds for disease. While the smell itself wasn't the direct cause of plague or dysentery, the conditions that created the smell, raw sewage in streets, contaminated water, piles of rotting garbage, were perfect habitats for rats, fleas, and bacteria. The smell was a symptom of a fundamentally unsanitary environment. It's a mainstream historical fact that urban mortality rates were generally higher than rural ones throughout the medieval period, and poor sanitation was a major contributing factor. Cities needed a constant influx of people from the countryside just to maintain their population levels, because so many died within the walls. So, while the general city air might assault your senses with a base note of general organic decay, venturing into specific areas like the market, the slaughterhouse district, or along the polluted riverbanks would expose you to truly concentrated horrors. These were places where the air felt thick, heavy, and actively hostile to your respiratory system. Places where the smell wasn't just unpleasant, but a physical presence, almost like a wall you had to push through. It makes you appreciate the relatively sterile environment of modern life, where the worst smell you're likely to encounter is perhaps a slightly iffy public restroom, or the aftermath of forgetting to take out the trash. Those pale in comparison to the daily, hourly reality of some medieval urban locations. You are walking through layers of accumulated history, quite literally, where every step might churn up the results of centuries of inadequate waste disposal. It's a pungent reminder that progress, even in something as seemingly simple as managing waste, has fundamentally altered our daily sensory world. And honestly, thank goodness for that. The specific horrors of the medieval stink are far, far better left in the history books and, thankfully, not in your modern nostrils. So you're immersed in this truly overwhelming sensory environment. The markets, the slaughterhouses, the general street filth, the rivers turned sewers. It's a constant, multifaceted assault on your nose. Day after day, year after year, you might be thinking, how did anyone live like that? Did they just get used to it? The answer, like most things in history, is complicated. But a big part of it is yes, a certain degree of sensory adaptation absolutely occurs. Our brains are remarkably good at filtering out constant stimuli, especially smells. Think about walking into a strong-smelling place today. A bakery, a coffee shop, a chemical factory, though hopefully not too often. For the first few minutes, the smell is intense. But if you stay there for a while, your brain starts to register it less and less. It doesn't disappear entirely, but it fades into the background, becoming part of the normal sensory landscape. This phenomenon is called olfactory fatigue or adaptation. Medieval city dwellers experienced this on a grand, somewhat horrifying scale. The baseline level of stench was so high that what we would consider unbearable today might have simply been the air to them. Your nose, constantly bombarded, would likely become desensitized to the most persistent elements, the underlying stink of sewage, decay, and smoke. It's not that they liked the smell or even stopped noticing it entirely, but the intensity would likely be perceived differently after prolonged exposure. Imagine living next to a rendering plant for years. Eventually, the smell might still be there, but it ceases to be the screaming, attention-demanding presence it was on day one. However, adaptation only goes so far. There were likely peaks and valleys in the smellscape. In certain areas, like the ones we discussed in the last section, would have been so overpoweringly foul that they likely cut through even the most hardened olfactory fatigue. Passing the fish market on a hot afternoon after rain, for instance, might have been a smell so potent and specific that it reset your olfactory senses with a jolt, reminding you exactly where you were and how bad it could get. It's like being so used to the background hum of traffic that you don't notice it until a fire engine siren blares past. That sound is too intense to fade into the background. Beyond mere adaptation, people also engage in conscious efforts to counteract or mask the smells. This is where things get interesting and sometimes a little sad. For the wealthy, masking smells was a matter of comfort and status. They could afford perfumes made from expensive imported spices, floral essences, or animal products like civet or musk. These perfumes were often very potent themselves, designed not for subtle allure like many modern scents, but for brute force olfactory combat. Think less light floral spritz and more full frontal assault of concentrated jasmine and something that smells suspiciously like animal rear end. Because, well, musk. Applying these perfumes to clothes, bodies, or even rooms was a way to create a small, personal bubble of more pleasant air within the general reek of the city. They also used aromatic herbs and spices liberally, not just in food, but as air fresheners of a sort. Sweet-smelling rushes or straw were laid on floors in wealthier homes, sometimes mixed with herbs like mint, lavender, or chamomile. These would release pleasant scents when walked upon, temporarily masking the less appealing smells that might be lingering, like, say, whatever had been tracked in from the street, or spills that hadn't been fully cleaned. Hanging bunches of herbs or flowers in rooms served a similar purpose. It was an attempt to layer agreeable smells on top of disagreeable ones, hoping the former would win out. For those lower down the social scale, expensive perfumes and imported spices were out of reach. Their methods were simpler, relying on locally available, often cheaper herbs. We touched on the idea of carrying a posy or small bunch of herbs to hold to the nose. This wasn't just a quaint tradition, it was a practical measure. Strong-smelling herbs like rue, wormwood, or even simple mint or thyme, crushed slightly, could provide a temporary olfactory shield when navigating the worst parts of the city. Imagine having to walk past a public latrine or a butcher's stall. Clutching a handful of pungent leaves and inhaling deeply might have been the only way to avoid gagging. This practice became particularly associated with the times of plague, as people believed the bad smells themselves carried the disease, the miasma theory, and pleasant, strong smells could ward it off. So the posy wasn't just about comfort, it was seen as a form of protection. Churches, often central to medieval life, also offered a degree of olfactory respite. Incense was burned during services, filling the space with the scent of frankincense, myrrh, and other resins. This not only had religious significance, but also served the practical purpose of masking the collective body odor of large congregations packed together in perhaps the general damp smell of old stone buildings. Stepping from the putrid street into the fragrant, smoky air of a church might have felt like entering a different, cleaner world. The practice of using strong smells to combat bad ones wasn't just about personal preference. It was deeply tied to the prevailing medical theories of the time. The concept of miasma, which dominated medical thought for centuries, held that diseases were caused by bad air or foul vapors, emanating from decaying organic matter. These bad smells were seen as the direct agents of illness. Therefore, purifying the air with sweet or pungent aromas, burning incense, carrying posies, scattering herbs, was believed to be a way to literally cleanse the air and prevent sickness. While we now know that germs, not smells, cause most infectious diseases, this belief drove many of the medieval attempts at smell management. It's a mainstream historical fact that the miasma theory heavily influenced public health efforts, or lack thereof, and personal practices regarding sanitation and smell. This leads to an interesting, albeit slightly depressing thought. Was life in a medieval city a constant, low-grade sensory battle? You adapt, you try to mask, you hold your breath, you use what little resources you have. But the underlying reality was always there. It makes you wonder about the psychological effect of living in a perpetually foul-smelling environment. Could it contribute to a general feeling of unease or depression? There's no easy way to study this historically, but the constant assault on a fundamental sense must have had some impact beyond just the physical unpleasantness. Historians still argue whether the focus on masking smells, based on miasma theory, actually hindered the adoption of more effective sanitation measures, like proper waste removal or clean water supply. Did the belief that you could ward off disease with a nice smell delay the understanding that you needed to get rid of the source of the smell, the filth itself? It's a complex chicken and egg question. While some early sanitation laws did exist, they were often poorly enforced and perhaps seen more as ways to reduce visible mess or extreme stench rather than fundamentally improving health by removing the underlying cause. Think about it like this. It's the difference between spraying air freshener in a room where the trash hasn't been taken out for weeks versus actually taking out the trash. The medieval approach, heavily influenced by miasma, was often more like the air freshener option, albeit with herbs and incense instead of aerosols. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this is the belief in the protective power of certain aromatic materials, sometimes even worn in amulets, specifically to ward off pestilence believed to be carried by foul air. These weren't just perfumes, they were seen as protective charms. Even bathing, which was practiced in various forms throughout the medieval period, though perhaps less frequently or in public bathhouses which sometimes had questionable hygiene themselves compared to private washing, might have been as much about temporary physical freshness in the face of constant environmental assault as it was about deep cleanliness. You might wash yourself and feel clean for an hour or two, but stepping back out into the street immediately re-exposed you to the pervasive odors that would cling to clothing and skin. So the picture is one of resilience and coping mechanisms. Humans are incredibly adaptable, and medieval city dwellers certainly had to be. They adapted to the sights, the sounds, and yes, the smells. They developed strategies, some rooted in primitive medical understanding, miasma, some purely for comfort or status, to try and make their olfactory world a little more bearable. But it was a constant struggle against overwhelming odds. The sheer volume of waste produced by a dense population with rudimentary or non-existent sanitation systems. The ability to simply get used to the background smell, combined with the conscious use of masking agents, allowed life to go on. People worked, traded, worshipped, socialized, and lived their lives surrounded by smells that would send most of us running for the hills, or at least a gas mask. It paints a vivid picture of a very different sensory reality, one where your nose was constantly engaged, often unpleasantly so. It makes you appreciate the invisible luxury of modern sanitation, of air that, while perhaps polluted by cars or industry in a different way, generally doesn't carry the immediate, gut-churning scent of raw decay and waste in the same pervasive manner as a medieval city street. You really dodged an olfactory bullet by being born in the modern era. So you've navigated the olfactory labyrinth of the medieval city, held your posy tight, perhaps even adapted to the background stench, and witnessed the desperate, sometimes misguided attempts to mask or mitigate the assault on your senses. You've seen the open sewers, the overflowing cesspits, the butchers and tanners and fishmongers contributing their distinct aromas to the already thick air. You've understood that for hundreds of years, millions of people lived in this reality, a constant, unavoidable engagement with the less than pleasant byproducts of human and animal life concentrated in a small area. It makes you pause and really think about the air you breathe, doesn't it? About the invisible systems that make modern urban life remotely tolerable from a sensory perspective. The legacy of this medieval smellscape isn't just a historical curiosity, it's a foundational layer of understanding why and how our cities evolved. Those pervasive stinks weren't just unpleasant. They were, whether people fully understood it or not, indicators of profound public health challenges. The constant presence of human and animal waste, decaying organic matter, and polluted water sources created breeding grounds for disease. While medieval people didn't grasp germ theory, the recurring devastating epidemics, the plague, dysentery, typhoid, were grim, undeniable evidence that something about urban life was fundamentally unhealthy. The miasma theory, as we discussed, was an early attempt to explain this, attributing illness to the foul air itself, which, while incorrect about the mechanism, at least pointed towards the right source, the filth. The slow, often glacial progress towards better sanitation wasn't driven by a sudden, widespread desire for pleasant smells alone. It was largely reactive, spurred by crisis. Major outbreaks of disease would intermittently shock authorities into action, leading to temporary crackdowns on dumping waste in the streets, attempts to clear rivers, or regulations on offensive trades. But without a true understanding of pathogens, these efforts were often piecemeal and short-lived, the city inevitably sliding back into its familiar state of fragrant, or rather malodorous, chaos once the immediate crisis passed. Think about the Great Stink of London in 1858. This wasn't the Middle Ages, but it shows how persistent the problem was, even much later. The Thames River, effectively a giant open sewer for a rapidly growing metropolis, became so incredibly foul during a hot summer that the stench paralyzed the city, forcing Parliament to act from sheer olfactory agony. It was this event, centuries after our medieval period, that finally provided the political will and funding for Joseph Bazalgette's massive revolutionary sewer system. That system, still largely in use today, is a direct descendant of the problems first highlighted, albeit on a smaller scale, by the medieval stench. The medieval city's smell problem wasn't just its problem, it was the starting point of a long, painful learning curve for urban humanity about the true cost of living cheek by jowl with your own waste. This transition from coping with omnipresent stench to actively managing. It is a fascinating historical process. Early attempts at urban regulations about waste disposal date back surprisingly far, even into the medieval period, but enforcement was notoriously difficult. People had limited options for disposal, and traditional habits died hard. It's one thing to say, don't dump your chamber pot in the street, and quite another to provide a viable, accessible alternative for thousands of households. The infrastructure simply didn't exist. A mainstream historical fact we can anchor this to is the development of municipal sanitation systems, starting in earnest in the 19th century, which represented a fundamental shift from individual or limited communal efforts to citywide engineered solutions. These systems, building on earlier innovations like covered drains and later flush toilets, gradually began to remove waste from the city environment rather than just moving it around within it or hoping it would wash away. This was the true game changer, the point where cities began to move away from the perpetual, overwhelming smell problem. But even these later systems faced challenges, and public perception was slow to catch up. A quirky or fringe tidbit related to this is the initial resistance to implementing large-scale sewer systems in some places, not just due to cost, but because disturbing the earth was sometimes feared to release bad humors or miasma trapped underground. The very solution to the smell problem was, in some circles, viewed with suspicion through the lens of the old smell-based theories of disease. It highlights how deeply ingrained the connection between smell and health was, even as understanding began to shift. Historians still argue whether the gradual improvement in urban health from the 19th century onwards was primarily due to these large-scale sanitation projects or other factors like improved nutrition, better housing, or changes in disease patterns. While germ theory provided the scientific why for sanitation, the when and how of its implementation and impact are subjects of ongoing debate. Was it the sewers themselves or the broader public health movement they were part of that made the biggest difference? Think about your garbage today. You put it in a bin, maybe a specific type for recycling, and a truck comes and takes it away. You don't see where it goes. You don't smell it unless you forgot to take it out for a really long time, and even then it's contained. Your wastewater disappears down a drain, and you never give it another thought. This entire complex, expensive infrastructure is a direct response to the problems you've just spent hours imagining in the medieval city. It's easy to forget that this level of waste management is a relatively recent achievement in human history, a luxury hard-won over centuries of literally wading through the problem. Being born in a time and place with functioning sanitation systems is, from an olfactory standpoint alone, hitting the historical lottery. You don't have to navigate streets where cesspit overflow is a daily hazard. You don't worry about the river being a soup of sewage and industrial waste. You don't constantly breathe air thick with the smell of decay, animal waste, and human effluvia. Your baseline sensory reality is so vastly different, so much cleaner, that it's almost impossible to truly feel what it was like to live back then, only to intellectualize it. And it's not just about the absence of bad smells, it's about the presence of clean air, clean water. The ability to walk outside and take a deep breath without gagging, to drink water from a tap without fear of immediate illness, to know that the waste generated by thousands or millions of people isn't accumulating right outside your door. This fundamental cleanliness is something most of us experience every single day without a second thought. It's the silent guardian of our health and comfort. So, as we wrap up this somewhat pungent journey through the medieval past, take a moment to truly appreciate the invisible infrastructure that protects your nostrils and your health. The miles of underground pipes, the waste treatment plants, the garbage collection routes, the regulations governing everything from industrial emissions to food handling. It's all part of the legacy of trying to solve the problems that the medieval city wallowed in. It's a reminder that progress, especially in something as seemingly basic as managing waste, is often slow, messy, and driven by necessity and crisis. You've survived the boring history of how medieval cities smelled. You've walked the reeking streets, peeked into the workshops, perhaps even imagined the questionable hygiene of a communal bathhouse. You've experienced, through the power of imagination and second-person narration, a sensory world that is almost alien to our own. And you've gained, hopefully, a newfound appreciation for the humble toilet, the sewer grate, and the weekly garbage truck. They might be boring, but they are the quiet heroes of modern olfactory life. As the imagined smells of fish guts, tanning chemicals, and overflowing cesspits begin to fade from your mind, replaced by the familiar, likely far milder, sense of your own space, let that appreciation linger for a moment. It's a small thing, gratitude for not living in a perpetual stink, but sometimes it's the small things that make the biggest difference to daily life. We've traveled through time and stenched together, exploring a fundamental, often overlooked aspect of historical reality. You've earned a break for your nose and your brain. The journey is complete. Now, as the echoes of those medieval streets grow quiet and the persistent imagined smells finally begin to dissipate completely, allow yourself to drift. The history is done, the journey through the past complete. There's nothing left to explore. No more sights or sounds or, blessedly, smells to confront. Just the gentle hum of the present moment, the air soft around you. Let your breath deepen, slow and steady. Feel the weight of your body settle. The complexities of the past, the challenges faced by those who came before, can recede now like the tide pulling back from the shore. You are here, safe and comfortable, in a world that, for all its own challenges, has solved some of the very oldest, most fundamental problems of urban life. There's a quiet comfort in that thought, isn't there? A simple, profound relief in the clean air that fills your lungs with each soft inhale. Let your muscles relax, your mind quiet. The stories have ended. The day is over. Just peace now. Sleep.